Oh, hi, everybody. It's good to see you. Thank you for joining. Sorry I'm blurry. I don't know what the hell's going on with this. Oh, internet. What are you going to do? What a day it's been. Hopefully everybody else's day has been decent. I sure hope so anyways. I was scrolling through some of these comments waiting for you all, or waiting for myself to hit play, and Buffy said, I have a thing for men with dark hair and emotionally unstable. Guess who I picked? Me. You picked me. No, I don't know. All right, let's hop right into the top, shall we? I think we shall. And here we go. Maybe. We'll see. Who knows? Oh, sometime in between that playing and everything else, looks like my signal chilled out for a second, which is nice. I don't know who got off the signal, but yay! Oh, nope, there it goes again. Oh well, what are you gonna do? I'm doing the best I can. Okay, so at least one announcement. As you all know, my vehicle was it's done. It's done. It's done. The engine seized. What else are you going to do? Nah. So it needs a new engine. Thereby, I'm not going to pay $9,600 for an engine. Anyways, I'm acquiring another car from family, but that requires them to come into town on Friday, and so Papa Bruce Crime is going to be in town on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and then leave Sunday. So I will not be able to stream on Friday, but my goal is to stream on Sunday to make up for the Friday. So just know that. I wish, yes, it is just the aliens. So I knew that this was not going to end well for this vehicle. But lucky, I'm counting my blessings since I do have an option. Some people do not have options; they're just screwed. And so I have the option to be able to do this, and I'm going to take it and offer my parents whatever the heck they want, because that's just how the world works these days for a 35-year-old. And so here we are. Uh, I'm gonna get drastically underpaid for this Hyundai without the engine obviously working. It makes sense. But yeah, here we go. Pop. Aw. Yes, he is fantastic. He's a wonderful human being. Can you meet him? We'll see what I can do. We'll see what I can do in terms of getting him on a stream or something. Maybe tomorrow if he feels like it. So yes, yeah, it is amazing. It's amazing how vital it is, and it's amazing how Virginia still makes you pay a luxury tax on it, because apparently a car is still a luxury and not a necessity. So that's lovely. I agree. We are under attack. It's happening. I can point a couple out to you. I just have to do a quick Google search. Hello, Shireen. How are you? Anyways, that's the saga. Hopefully the saga is over by Friday. That's the goal. So, And so, yeah, no, Papa BC is cool. He's awesome. He's a 36 years career military, retired just a little while ago. And boy, oh boy, I learned a lot about leadership and stuff from him, and just a great guy all around. So I sure appreciate him. Air's gonna have to turn off. There's way too much background in my ears. So yeah, luxury tax on all vehicles in Virginia, unless you're in the military. So yes, no matter what. So yay. Oh no, he's plenty of nonsense. Oh, plenty of nonsense. He's not like a drill instructor whatsoever. I mean, animals that fart are hysterical to him. Probably the funniest thing that exists. So um I will let him know. I absolutely will let him know. If you want to know where my crazy sense of humor came from, oh boy, it's him for sure. You have more horsepower than I do, Ricky. You certainly do. Um yes, we are glad that you joined us tonight for sure. So just join the military, so easy. Not that guy, you know. All right. So I did try to play the whole guilt card on Hyundai, but I don't think that's going to work. You all asked for it a while ago. I'm probably not going to leave it up the entire time just because of the whole service thing. But look, hey, look, you got yourself a. I'm not going to say his name. If I say his name, he's going to stand up. So you got yourself the Cam. We're going to call it the Cam, the King Cam. So he's chilling. He's chilling, eating a bone, and having a good time. So, I've also got treats here so that I can tell him that if he stays there, good things happen, and he gets comfortable just laying there. He's a puppy. He doesn't want to sit down at all. Hold on. I did see that. I knew I saw that. I'm not crazy. I mean, I am crazy, but not because of that. So,
hello, puppet.
Hello, puppet. No. Sorry, Nan, not frozen. Just cruddy signal, which means what? Which means we're gonna go straight into Jodi's trial. I almost did it again. One day I'll figure this out. One day. So we're gonna hop right on into the trial. Where were we? Hold on one second. Let me see where we were here. Oh yes, we were done with Jodi. We were all done with Jodi, and so biopsychologist, Dr. Richard Samuels takes the stand, and this should be fascinating. Here we go.
Record will show the presence of the defendant and all counsel. Mr. Martinez, did you have something you wanted to put on the record?
This morning, as we were preparing for the court, I noticed that Mr. Samuels was preparing a PowerPoint. And although I have no objection to their work product being presented, I do have an objection to new materials that are being presented. I interviewed this individual, and prior to that interview, he provided a report based on his findings of the clinical interview with the defendant, as well as the testing interview that he conducted with the defendant. And at that time, we discussed all of his notes and all of his findings. Today, it's a new story. All of these slides, every one of these, are new to the state. There's an issue with disclosure here under Rule 15. I'm sure this is not something that was done overnight, and I'm sure this is something that could have been provided in advance of this. But I will specifically designate the slides for the court.
All goes through my headphones.
And my objection
Nobody
to it.
hears a doggone thing.
Specifically, one of the things that he talks about, or the first slide, is a cross-section of the brain. Mr. Samuels is a psychologist, not a psychiatrist or a medical doctor. He never indicated to me that he had any training in any sort of issues related to the brain. Now he's bringing a cross-section of the brain. I don't know exactly what he's going to say as it applies to the defendant, and that's the problem. The second slide involves a Time magazine article, and it's titled "Your Brain Under Fire." I don't know how that is relevant, what somebody in Time magazine thinks about your brain under fire, but it's also hearsay, and I do believe it would be unreliable. I did not read the article. The constraints of time did not allow me to even assimilate exactly what it was saying. Number 3 is a slide from a quote from Time magazine from an article dated January 28, 2013, in which it says something like your brain under fire. Again, I don't see the relevance to this case, what somebody in Time magazine may have written. And if they were going to use it, certainly they should have disclosed it. And number 4, and there's a slide about PTSD, something like that, mentally something or other, and it's written by a PhD. I didn't even have time to write down the whole section of it, but it's, again, new material that was available before. Somehow they've chosen to hide it and present it in a somewhat surprised manner today. Number 5 is a slide involving something called intrusive memories. It's an article. And again, this was not disclosed. I don't know exactly what it says because I didn't get a chance to meaningfully read it. Number 6, it talks about correlation or something like that, a victim-offender relationship. And then he starts talking about 2 types of homicide, instrumental and expressive. These were never mentioned by this individual when we conducted the interview. What he did indicate as part of his report was that he believed that this was not a premeditated act and that it was in self-defense. Of course, the court has already ruled that he cannot express those views, and now he's talking about something called instrumental and expressive homicide, something that's totally new, something that's new to the table here, and clearly it's just unfair to expect the state to just look at that and somehow be able to respond to that. Number 7, 8 and 9, and maybe 10, all talk about this instrumental and reactive homicide, or these 2 types of homicide. Obviously, he feels that he needs to define them for the jury. I don't know what the definition of instrumental or reactive is, but number 7 is a definition of both instrumental and reactive. Number 8 talks about purely reactive homicide. Number 9 is purely instrumental homicide. And number 10 talks about instrumental and expressive homicide as it applies to Finland, or a Finnish study that was conducted. Again, none of this has been disclosed to the state. The next slide that he has indicates it's violence and personality disorders. And I don't know who authored that. I was writing quickly, but again, if he was going to hang his hat on this, he should have told us about it. The report is clear that this doctor opines that what the defendant had, and his opinion is that the defendant suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder at the time of this killing. And it involved a certain stressor that triggered this post-traumatic stress disorder. Now we're talking about totally different things, and it appears that this opinion has been tailored to maybe perhaps conversations that this individual may have had with the defendant recently. And the reason that I say that is that his report was completed back on June 21 of 2010. And I do know that as recently as of December of last year, he was still visiting the defendant. So it appears that maybe
6 parts.
I don't even know what he was thinking at that point. So number 13, it talks about amnesia and crime and dissociative amnesia, something he didn't talk to me about. 14 is transient amnesic syndromes. Again, nothing that he discussed with me. And then 15 is transient global amnesia. And these all have the text of this particular idea that he wants to express. So it's not that it hasn't been in written form. It's not that they couldn't have turned this over to me. It's just that they waited till the morning of court. And number 16, which is the last one, I believe, talks about the stressed hippocampus, something about synaptic plasticity and cost memories, something like that. I object to all of those. He has a report. I interviewed him with regard to that report. Now he comes in with something totally new and different. Not only does he come in with something new and different, but he comes in it in PowerPoint form. And the reason that's particularly egregious because that took some time to put together and that's been available for some time. If we were to look at the other side of the coin and, for example, my expert, Janine DeMarte, were to come in here with a PowerPoint in which she had totally changed what she had talked about. And at that point, I guess I could say we can only imagine what would happen if I were to say to the court, well, they can just look at it minutes before this and, take a look at it and see if there's anything new there. Let's just go forward. My view with regard to this presentation is that he has changed it. We arrive here after having interviewed him, and that's the purpose of the interview, so that we know what he's going to say. If he's going to change something, there is a duty to tell us about it. And I think that they have forsaken that duty. It's a violation of Rule 15, and I have no problem with him testifying, but I do have a problem with his PowerPoint and any new opinions that he may come up with. So I would object to that.
Ms. Wilmot.
Well, Judge, when the state says he has no objection to Dr. Samuel's testifying, but yet he objects to the PowerPoint, what he's saying is he objects to his testimony altogether. My guess is because it is actually helpful for Ms. Arias, and that's what the objection is coming from. All of these PowerPoint slides are something that is used to explain to the jury what Dr. Samuels is talking about. He is an expert. He has an expertise above and beyond what this jury, a typical jury, would understand, because he is a doctor.
Rude.
So what these slides do, assist the jury in understanding his expertise. Nothing is new. I can vouch to the court that this PowerPoint was completed this morning prior to coming to court. So that's why I'm more than happy to have him review them again, and he can take as much time as he wants. With regard to the actual opinions, Dr. Samuels is not changing his opinion at all. His opinion will be, and as it was in the report and during the interview when the state interviewed him, is that Ms. Arias suffers from PTSD. That is not changing. When he's talking about the picture of the brain and his objection to the picture of the brain, because he says that Dr. Samuels is a psychologist and therefore has no training in the brain. I think any psychologist out there would probably object, including his own Dr. DeMarte, because that's what psychology is the study of the brain. So to be able to claim that Dr. Samuels is somehow not an expert and unable to explain the different parts of the brain and how they work and how they affect actions or memories is ridiculous. The picture of the brain is talking specifically about the amygdala and the hippocampus and how memories are formed. During his interview and in the report, Dr. Samuels talks about Ms. Arias suffering from a dissociative state. In other words, she is in complete denial about what happened. She's not dealing with her feelings. She doesn't have a memory of what happened. He talks about those memory gaps. The picture of the brain is there to assist the jury so that Dr. Samuels can explain to the jury why that might happen. And since the state on cross really went into the fact that Ms. Arias seems to have some kind of a mental problem because she can't remember things, it's incumbent now upon the defense, especially for Dr. Samuels, to be able to point to the brain and say there are physiological reasons why people don't remember things in high stress situations. And that's what Dr. Samuels needs the brain for, so that he can actually show the jury the parts of the brain that affect memory. And if the court wants to, he can come in and we can do testimony about why he's qualified to do that after 30 years in his doctorate. With regard to the Time magazine article, these are articles that he relies on in his research with regard to explaining memory and what the events and what sudden stressful events do to a person. The Time magazine article is just put in layman's terms so that the jury can better understand what happened. And what it is it's about a police officer who shoots somebody. And Dr. Samuels has a lot of experience in this type of work, actually, because he worked for the police department back in New Jersey, talking about PTSD that occurs with police officers when they have a shooting, even though that's what they're trained in the possibility of it happening. The relevance of that is to discuss what happens physiologically to the body.
He seems okay.
When there's a high stress event, what happens to the amygdala, what happens to the hippocampus, what happens physiologically, that draining that we feel from the adrenaline rush, all of that. So it's used to help explain to the jury in terms that they can understand what happens under high-stress situations and why in those high-stress situations memories may not be formed or implanted, I should say. With regards to the PTSD articles and intrusive memory slides,
Judge is over
they
it.
discussed during their
Over
interview,
it.
obviously his report diagnosed
Emily
with
Looney.
PTSD. This is explaining what
Appreciate it.
PTSD is. These are articles and research that are well relied upon in the scientific community, so he is allowed to discuss it. He is allowed to rely on those articles, being an expert under 702. So that is nothing that is disallowed. The slide is just so that he can help explain it to the jury. It's meant for an instructional explanation to the jury. And again, the jury's not going to get it. They're not going to have it back with them. So it's not like it's going to be confusing to them. It's just the opposite. And because he's an expert, it's not hearsay, because it's something that he relies upon in the scientific community. With regard to the slides regarding instrumental and expressive, that was also disclosed in his interview. He mentions, Dr. Samuel specifically talks about the fact that based on his training and experience, he believes that this was an unplanned crime, that this is not something that was pre-planned or premeditated. That has since been not allowed to be discussed. I'm not going to ask him that. But his reasoning for that, which, Mr. Martinez did not ask him during the interview, and we don't need to give him a roadmap of what he needs to ask. But based on his training and experience, the reason why he can say that is because there's research with regard to instrumental crimes and expressive crimes. Instrumental crimes are crimes that are premeditated. There is a goal to do something, and if somebody gets in the way of your goal, then a homicide occurs. Expressive crimes are typically more violent, and they are also more spur of the moment type crimes. There's no thinking ahead of time. A lot of times these types of crimes, there's been a lot of research which Dr. Samuels is relying upon in the scientific community to talk about these two different crimes and how they relate to crime scenes. So typically in premeditated crime scenes, you don't see as much of the violence, you don't see the melee, the craziness. In expressive crimes, you tend to see the craziness. That's ultimately how he gets to his opinion with regard to why he believes that this was not a premeditated crime. I'm not going to ask him that opinion. He knows not to go into it. But he can certainly talk about the different types of crimes and the research that goes into the types of crimes and the crime scenes and what the research tells us. It's not an opinion, it's just research that he's explaining. With regard to the one slide with regard to personality disorder, he's not changing his opinion. He's not going to say that Ms. Arias is suffering from some different personality disorder. It's just, it follows on the explanation of the expressive crimes versus instrumental crimes and how there's a link to different personality disorders associated with these expressive versus instrumental. So again, it's just explanatory, and it goes to the research that he relies upon in the scientific community, that's well accepted in the scientific community. The amnesia slides, dissociative amnesia, global, I think, amnesia. Those are all something the state has been made aware of through their interview and through the report. The state full well knows in this interview and in speaking with Dr. Samuels during his interview that Ms. Arias has no memory of what occurs and very vague memories of that after the shooting. That is something we've talked about for the past 18 days. So what those slides have to do with is the fact that that's actually consistent. Amnesia in somebody who experiences a high stress situation like this can be expected, and it's not inconsistent to happen. So again, it's research that Dr. Samuels relies upon, that it's well based in the scientific community that he relies upon to talk about amnesia and to talk about the dissociative state and to talk about Ms. Arias' actions afterwards and why she can't remember certain things. That's something that went into by the state on cross ad nauseum. And so certainly at this point, because it's already been noticed in his report, they talked about the dissociative state. It's something that this is being used to explain to the jury the science behind it, basically. And that's what a doctor does. That's what an expert does. They explain the science behind it. Other than that, Judge, I take issue with the fact that the state claims that this is a last minute, we're trying to hide something. He interviewed Dr. Samuels a long time ago. Nothing is new.
When did you interview Dr. Samuels, Mr. Martinez?
July 19th, 2011.
Ms. Lamont, is it your position that Dr. Samuels has not changed his opinion since that date?
That's correct, he has not.
Mr. Martinez?
Well, that's true that he hasn't changed his opinion. He still wants to bring in through the back door that this was a non-premeditated crime by now couching it in terms of instrumental and expressive. You've specifically precluded them from doing that. And so how is it that we are now going to allow him to testify about anything such as instrumental? In other words, he's going to, by what I hear, he's going to say, oh, based on my looking at this scene, based on my speaking to the defendant, I can now say that this was not an instrumental crime, wasn't pre-planned. It was unplanned, which goes to the ultimate issue of fact and invades the province of the jury. You've already ruled that that issue does not come in. So under any circumstances, whether or not there has or hasn't been disclosure, this issue involving the instrumental versus expressive crime issue should not be allowed. The other items, if she says that, for example, that this is something that I've known about, I certainly have known about the fact that she has this or has claimed that she has amnesia. There's no reason why he can't say it. There's no reason why he can't explain it. Why do we need to read it? If they were going to do that, they could have just provided it to us so that I could go back, for example, and take a look at whatever article he's talking about. How am I going to be able to all of a sudden drop everything, go take a look at whatever this article says so that I can then turn around and cross-examine him on that? That's the unfairness of that issue. And it may be that that is the opinion, but and with regard to the Time magazine article, I don't think that that's anything that experts routinely rely on what is printed in Time magazine. But
this is going to be interesting.
I have a grave concern regarding this instrumental versus reactive definition of what the crime is. Psychologists do not have the authority or the power under the law to tell a jury whether a crime is premeditated or not. That invades their province. And so under any circumstances, I do not believe that that's appropriate.
Ms. Wilmot?
I just want to clear something up. I'm not going to ask him if this was an instrumental crime or an expressive crime. I'm not going there. I'm not going to ask him anything of the sort. He's just explaining the research with regard to expressive and instrumental crimes. That is all. I'm not asking him the final opinion. I would know better than that. With regard to unfairness to the state because of the articles that he relies on, that's something that occurs every day in trial when any expert testifies. An expert can't lay out the millions of articles that they've read throughout the years that makes them an expert. If they did so, we would all be experts. That's the point of an expert. He has these articles that he relies upon.
And then, Judge, my motion in limine, which is still, the ruling is still in place, he can't talk about what a premeditated crime is. He can't talk what a non-premeditated crime is, or a crime of passion. That's something for the jury to decide. The fact that he's going to say, for example, certain crimes are not premeditated, and these are the characteristics, invades the province of the jury. He can't talk about that. He can talk about the defendant's state of mind. He can certainly talk about that all day long. But with regard to that ultimate issue of fact, that's for the jury to decide, not for him.
Judge, the minute entry, the motion in limine is regarding whether or not he can opine to premeditation. He can't, and I'm not asking for that. The questioning is not about, the research is not about premeditated crimes. This is the way they always go. It's just that there's research that links certain types of crime scenes to premeditation, certain types of crime scenes to expressive crimes. Is it always like that? No. And he's free to cross on that. But I'm not going to ask him the final question, and it's not invading the province of the jury when we're talking about the research that goes into crime scenes and state of minds.
All right. It is now 11:15. It appears that while the defense does not believe there is anything new, the state disagrees. So what I'm going to do is take a recess, allow the state to speak with your expert again. I'm going to have everyone back here at 1 o'clock. We will make a record at that time. regarding the legal issues. This is obviously something that should have been raised in a motion in limine before trial if there was a problem. But that ship has sailed. So I'll see you back here at 1 o'clock. Mr. Martinez, you need to interview Dr. Samuels. We will let the jury know to be back here at 1:15. All right, anything else?
No.
Mr. Martinez, did you have an opportunity to interview Dr. Samuels?
I did.
Do you have anything to add?
Yes, I believe I now understand what some of the terms mean. For example, he being Dr. Samuels indicated to me that the issue involving instrumental murder is actually nothing more than just another word for premeditated murder. And that expressive murder is nothing more than heat of passion, kind of unplanned kind of murder. And what his testimony was what his proposed testimony is that he's going to define what this instrumental or premeditated murder is. He's also going to define for the jury what this expressive or heat of passion, unplanned kind of murder is. It's the state's position that he cannot, under the law,
Detective Flores, he's the
define a
lead
crime for the
detective
jury.
on this
He's a
case.
psychologist. The only
And Juan made him
people or
sit
the
there
only
every-
entity that can
every
define a
day.
crime is the
I don't know
legislature.
why.
So basically what this individual is trying to do is impinge, if you will, on the legislature's province and tell them or define
You
for
were,
them what
yeah.
this crime is. There is no
We've had him.
area of expertise that would allow anybody to testify
year.
that, whether they be a psychologist, whether they be a lawyer. The analogy to that would be a lawyer coming up there unrelated to this case and saying, these are the cases of instrumental murder that I've seen, and these are the cases of expressive murder that I've seen. That's just not something that the rules allow. Additionally, should that be allowed, of course, the court can envision a situation where the states would then bring in an expert to indicate that these are the elements of premeditated murder or instrumental murder, and these are the instances of expressive murder. So I do not believe that that type of inquiry should be allowed. Thank you.
After hearing him do all this,
Ms.
I don't find
Salma.
it odd at all.
Judge, he's not defining what premeditation means. He's not defining what heat of passion means. That would be a legal definition. That's not what this is about. What he's talking about is research. It's specific research that has been done in areas of crime scene investigation and research about the types of people who are committing different crimes. And it's talking about the crime scene and different types of crime scenes and what can we learn from the different types of crime scenes. He will certainly say that just because a crime scene is bloody and messy doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't premeditated. That's true. And vice versa is true. So he's not trying to give a definition, a legal definition at all. This is based on actual research that has been done, which is why there are authors noted, it's the research he relies upon, about the types of different crimes there are with regard to homicide, planned and unplanned. And when the correlations between planned and the crime scene and the correlation between unplanned and the crime scenes. That's what he's talking about. There is no opinion given what he thinks in this case. It's just the background and the research of it.
So why is this relevant?
Oh, is it relevant? Well,
Good
initially in his
question.
original report,
Objection,
he did talk,
hearsay.
he ultimately gives the opinion that he
Your
believes
Honor,
it's not
I
premeditated.
object.
It was not premeditated. We're not going to that opinion, but part of his interaction with Ms. Arias and his review of the crime scene and the review of the police reports and even what Detective Flores said in his own police report that this crime scene was messy and a heat of passion type crime scene. All of that is relevant to whether or not ultimately the jury can decide whether or not Ms. Arias committed this in self-defense or committed this in a planned way. Given that we know that there's actual scientific research that exists about crime scenes and what they can potentially tell us, it makes it more or less probable when we talk about guilt and innocence. That's how it becomes relevant.
Mr. Martinez?
Well, if that's the case under 401, 402, and 403, the danger of confusion to the jury is obviously imminent in this type of circumstance. There is no any amount of research that can aid anybody coming into this court or any court across the land to say that just by looking at a crime scene, you can divine whether or not the state of mind of the person that was committing the crime. It could be a very bloody scene, for example, and such as this one, and Mr. Samuels can opine, which is what he would probably say, that given the research, those types of crime scenes are unplanned. Or he could say that a very horrible scene is
very
planned.
Purposeful note taking.
The issue with that is that it's confusing. There isn't any science out there that actually, with any reasonable scientific certainty, can tell you that just by looking at a crime scene, irrespective of how many degrees you have or how many crime scenes you've been to, that you can know the state of mind of the defendant. Check, please. And so for that reason, I think it would be overly confusing under 401, 402, and 403, and unduly prejudicial. And so I would object.
Judge, there's nothing confusing. In fact, it would be exactly the opposite. It's not confusing to the jury to let him be able to explain the scientific research that is out there. So when the state talks about there is no research out there, that's just wrong. And rather than spending his time in the interview asking about the research, which he didn't, he would have learned that there is a lot of research that is in regard to criminal scenes and things like that. If the state is objecting now because it's prejudicial, because somehow there is no research that supports what Dr. Samuels is saying and citing authorship to, or not his authorship, but other authors in different articles, then that's a Daubert motion, and that's something that should be briefed and in writing, and we'd have to have a hearing.
I agree. I think a hearing would be appropriate. I'm not prepared to rule on the admissibility of this evidence without hearing the testimony and the basis for the testimony on this issue. So I will set an evidentiary hearing. Without this testimony, is the defense prepared to present some part of Dr. Samuel's testimony today?
Can I just have 1 second, Judge?
Yes.
No.
We can do
All
it.
right. Let me just
Cannot finish
follow
your
up on a
Sudoku
couple of
puzzle.
objections the state raised earlier. There was an objection to the PowerPoint, including some excerpts from a magazine periodical. Are you still urging that objection?
He indicated that it was anecdotal and that he could just as well relate it to the jury. So that's the basis of the objection.
Judge, that mischaracterizes what was done in the interview. What was done in the interview was basically a cross-examination wherein when Dr. Samuels attempted to explain that he likes to have pictures of the brain up there whenever he teaches, which he does quite often to students, it's helpful for people to understand what he's talking about. He was not allowed to complete his answers, and Mr. Martinez would stop him. So ultimately, that's not true. Dr. Samuels would like to have the pictures because it makes it easier for jurors to understand.
We were talking about the Time magazine.
Right. The brain, is there any objection to the brain?
Other than disclosure issues, no.
All right. I'm going to permit you to use your PowerPoint showing the brain. My concern is the excerpts from the article. I haven't seen them. Are they verbatim? Are they just words and phrases?
They're quotes, basically, and it's basically used for an example to start talking, because we're talking about the brain and what happens to certain areas of the brain when it's under high stress and the physiological changes that occur. The Time magazine article is just an anecdotal example, basically, of what happened to a police officer when he underwent a high period of stress, and that's somebody who's actually specifically trained. Certainly, I know the state has said over and over again that Dr. Samuels can discuss it. He doesn't need the slides, but if he can discuss it, I don't see the reason why there can't be the slide up there as well.
Do you have a copy of the slide?
I don't have a paper copy. I just have it on the.
Can we put it up on the
object
screen?
to my brain.
He turned his computer off and took.
Please.
Your Honor,
Yes.
this is a picture that's not related
boy.
to the magazine article, but I have two quotes from the magazine article. Should I go to those?
Yes, please.
That's it, Your Honor, just another picture of the brain.
Ms. Wilmot, before these slides are shown, I assume there will be some testimony.
Yes, Judge, we were going to lay foundation as to the physiological changes in the brain and things like that.
All right. Before you show the slides, let me know so that we can have a bench conference to discuss the admissibility. I think I need to hear that testimony before I can rule on the admissibility.
Okay.
All right. Anything else before we bring in the jury?
This one.
I'm sorry, Judge.
I said, is there anything else before you bring in the jury?
Not from us.
Oh, I can't wait.
With regard to the two issues involving instrumental murder and expressive murder, there will be an evidentiary hearing. We will either do that this afternoon or tomorrow, depending on how far we get today. So the record is clear. The court is going to
Brain on
permit
13th
the
juror.
brain diagram to be used by Dr. Samuels. The court finds this diagram will assist the jury in understanding Dr. Samuels' testimony. With regard to the PowerPoint, I do intend to advise the jury by giving them a limiting instruction on the use of the PowerPoint.
What's the limiting instruction?
I'm going to advise the jury that they may consider the PowerPoint during the testimony of the witness. It may be used to assist them in understanding the testimony of the witness. It will not go back to the jury room during deliberations. And a copy will be marked and preserved for possible appeal purposes, so you'll need to provide one to the clerk. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ms. Wilmot, you may call the next witness.
Thank you. Defense calls Dr. Rick Hill.
Dr. Samuels, please come forward to be sworn right up here, please.
Raise your right hand. You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Ah, he reminds me of Gus. Oh boy.
Could you tell us your name, please?
Richard M. Samuels.
And I called you doctor. Are you a doctor?
I am.
All right, let's start with that. What are you a doctor of?
I have a PhD in biopsychology.
Okay, and what does that mean?
That means after completing my master's degree, prior to that a bachelor's degree, and prior to that an associate's degree, I completed my studies at the City University of New York in psychology with a submajor rather, in biopsychology. So it was more of a biological basis of behavior background.
Okay. Did I give you enough time to get comfortable up there?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so let's talk a little bit more about your education then, okay?
Sure.
You said you got your doctorate in New York?
Yes.
And what happens when you get your doctorate? Do you have to do any further training?
Well, it depends what you want to do with your degree afterwards. In my particular case, I did an internship, a clinical internship at the Robert Wood Johnson Medical School in Piscataway, New Jersey. And I spent a year there being supervised by therapists and clinicians, taking additional courses, as well as getting my feet wet doing psychotherapy.
And a clinical internship, what exactly are you doing?
Well, during that period of time, we attend classes, we see patients, just a few at a time, and we are supervised by the staff, by people that have had much more experience, obviously, than I did at the time. And the process goes on like that, building up your clinical skills and developing a sense of confidence, working with patients, discussing the approaches that you're using, getting feedback from the supervisors with respect to the techniques that are being used, and basically becoming comfortable being on your own at some point, seeing patients.
Okay, and you said you did that for a year?
I did that for a year, and then after that, I went to the New Jersey Medical School.
It appears that he's looking at something. If that's the case, can we know what that is?
Yes, sir. Are you looking at a document?
I'm looking at my CV.
If we just have that marked as an exhibit and he can refer to it at that point.
Do you have a copy to mark as an exhibit?
Why does he need to refer to
I
his
may.
CV?
Is that copy?
You're welcome to this
You're not
after I
living?
finish looking at it.
Or are you
It's a
making it up?
little annotated, but you're welcome to it. Can I show it to you?
We will mark that copy
Sure.
and hand it back to you.
Sure, hold on.
Does it help you to remember?
Well, it's pretty lengthy, so I usually skip things.
No, it's pretty lengthy.
The clinical internship occurred in 1974 or 5.
Okay, so looking at your CV, does that help you remember exactly what you did in
Yes.
terms of education?
Sure.
All right, so after that year of clinical internship, you were telling us what you did next.
Then I went to the New Jersey Medical School and was appointed into the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And I was the first PhD student to enter their postdoctoral fellowship program. This one was in human sexuality. And during the year and a half that took, I studied with gynecologists, psychiatrists, urologists, specialists in the field, Masters and Johnson, other people well known at the time.
Does anybody find it interesting that he's talking about what he's talking about, and then he just said the names Masters and Johnson?
And learned how to do sex therapy, which was very popular at that time.
Okay,
And then after that, I took another year of supervised supervision, had another year of supervision so that I would qualify for later board examinations.
okay, and what, a year of supervision in what, clinical?
In clinical,
Clinical psychology?
yes, clinical psychology.
All right, and after, do you have to do any more of your clinical rotations like that after that?
Well, after I finished those, I would attend seminars, classes. More recently, we do online work, consult with peers and so forth. But those were the years of my most intensive training.
Okay, and out of those intense training, you end up with a PhD.
Well, the PhD is actually granted before then, but before you can become licensed, you have to have your internship. Before you can get an advanced diplomate diploma, which I've achieved, you need additional supervision beyond that. But I also did the postdoctoral fellowship, which is considered a degree higher than a PhD.
Okay, and that you said was in sex therapy,
Human sexuality.
sexuality, sorry. All right, and so after all of this, you talked about getting a license?
My first license to practice psychology independently was in the state of New Jersey in 1975.
All right, and you said something about taking boards. What is that?
Yes. As you advance in the field with additional training, additional testing, you can get what's called a diplomate diploma. Only about 5% of practicing psychologists ever achieve that level. And so I enrolled in classes, and I had to undergo an examination, a interview by 6 of my peers, a presentation of a case and so forth. And I was finally granted the diplomate in clinical psychology in 1980.
Okay. And is that something you have to keep up, or once you have it, you have it?
Well, once you have it, you have it. But on the other hand, in order to renew your license, you need to take a certain number of continuing education credits, which I have been able to do.
All right, and is that what you were talking about when you say that you go to seminars and online?
That's correct.
Also?
Yes.
All right. With regard to education, have we hit all of the education?
That's pretty much it.
Okay, so once you're licensed, and you are licensed as a clinical psychologist, where do you work? What do you do?
Well, in New Jersey, I kept a position with the medical school, and I became the co-director of the state's first clinic for sex therapy, for doing sex therapy for married couples. After
Why?
several years, I had the opportunity to go into private practice,
being
and eventually
admitted
we had 3 different offices
as an
to treat
expert for what he's about to talk about.
sexual dysfunction. But in my role at the medical school, I also became the director of the state's first and only gender dysphoria clinic, which now is referred to as transgender clinic. And I worked with about 150 different patients who had that particularly difficult problem.
And let me interrupt you for a second. What timeline are we talking about now?
This is now going into the late 70s into the early 80s.
Okay. All right, and then so after that, where were you? How long did you stay in the private practice?
I was in private practice in New Jersey until about 1993, 94. And I was involved in a couple of other psychology-related business ventures, but I moved out to Arizona full-time about 7 years ago, although I had been commuting back and forth between here and New Jersey since 1989. And I saw patients, I saw clients here. Here in Arizona, I did only forensic work. Back in New Jersey, I finished up with some patients I had, conducted some of the business that I had, and did forensic work back there in New York and New Jersey.
Okay. And you talked about you had some other psychological ventures?
Yes.
What were those?
We have a company that's called Guardian Elder Care. We provide psychologists and social workers to nursing homes and long-term care facilities to provide psychological counseling for elderly people.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, that was out back there, back in New Jersey. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Anything else in New
Reverse
Jersey
bangs.
then?
That's pretty much it.
Okay. When you in New Jersey, did you ever do any work with the government?
Yes, actually, I did, and I'm sorry I forgot that. I had worked as a consultant to various police departments and also to the state police. And I worked with clients of theirs, officers who were involved in shooting incidents and who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I did a fairly large number of psychological evaluations, saw some of them as patients in my practice, would clear them for going back to work if that was the case, or would help them go through disability. Many police officers who accidentally or perhaps in the line of duty killed someone with their gun or whatever.
Let me read to you what I just found. Dr. Richard Samuels, Arizona-based expert psychological witness in the Jodi Arias trials, no longer allowed to operate as a psychologist due to an ethics charge that was brought against him several years ago. Dr. Samuels was fined in a custody case in which he was unethical. In an administrative action filed with New Jersey Bond of Psychological Examiners, Dr. Richard Samuels, currently of Scottsdale, Arizona, was fined $2,500 in the year 2000 due to a conflict of interest for his involvement in a child custody lawsuit. Samuels bartered dental services from the father in exchange for, quote, psychotherapeutic services. The doctor proceeded to testify on behalf of the father without even interviewing the child's mother. The board also ordered Samuels to complete continuing education courses on ethics and boundaries issues. He was licensed in New Jersey in 1975 and in the state of Arizona in 1989. He's practicing as a clinical and forensic psychologist out of Scottsdale, although he's like 80 now. Wow. That's all I'm going to say is wow. And wow. Just wow.
Developed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and many of them couldn't function. I got those guys, and at that time they were only men, and helped to either evaluate them or to get them back on their feet.
All right. And did you do any court-appointed work in New Jersey?
Yes, actually in New Jersey, I did a lot of court-appointed work on many of these state police cases. I would be court-appointed to do the evaluation and to sometimes follow through with therapy. I did work in the custody area, and I would be court-appointed for that.
Fire.
I've done work in the...
I'm sorry, let me interrupt you for a second. When we say court-appointed, can you explain to us what that means?
Well, it's a little bit different in New Jersey than it is here, but sometimes either the nature of the case or the fact that the prosecutor and the defense attorney were able to get together and agree that instead of having separate evaluations, one for each side, they would agree on an evaluator, and that evaluator would be appointed by the court, and it would become a neutral evaluation, and the report would go to the judge.
And is that what you're talking about with the kind of work you did in New Jersey?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You were saying that you did this type of work for custody cases? Custody cases,
other kind of domestic violence cases. I did a lot of medical malpractice cases as well, but those were not court-appointed usually. And but I did a lot of forensic work back east.
All right, and forensic work, is that what you would consider forensic work, the court appointments?
The court appointments, yes. Or sometimes I would be retained by either the prosecution or by the defense.
Okay.
Cases.
Does that cover New Jersey?
Pretty much.
Okay. And you said you moved out to Arizona.
Moved out to Arizona.
And when was that? I know you're going back and forth for a while.
Yeah. I think we first came out here in about 86, 88. I don't remember the date exactly, but I commuted for 13 years. 2 weeks in New Jersey, 2 weeks here. And the attempt was to build up a practice here and conclude my business in New Jersey. It took a lot longer than I had anticipated, but eventually I was able to move out here, and I've been here full-time, I think around 6 or 7 years.
Okay. And what kind of practice did you build here in Arizona?
Forensic only.
Okay.
I only do forensic cases here, no therapy.
Okay. Is there a reason for that?
Well, the reimbursement rates were a lot lower out here, and I had done therapy for about 34 years, so I had enough.
No, sir.
You had enough?
Enough.
Okay. And so how many years then have you been doing forensic work in Arizona?
Well, since I moved out here.
2013.
In fact, I think I had my first case in '89 here.
All right. And forensic work
He moved out here 'cause he
in
couldn't
Arizona,
practice
is
in
it
New
similar to
Jersey
what you're
anymore.
talking about in New Jersey with the court appointments?
Not as much, no. I have been court appointed, particularly in Yuma County, but less so in Maricopa County.
All right.
I did, and I began doing my work primarily in the area of psychosexual risk assessments and sexually violent perpetrator cases, because that was my specialty area, and I fit right into that area.
All right. And did you do other types of cases as well?
Yes, I've done a number of criminal cases, some murder cases. I've done some restoration work.
What's restoration?
Restoration is if a client, if a patient is deemed to be mentally unfit, or if they have an emotional problem, we make a determination and they can go to the state hospital where they are restored to the point where they can go back to trial. So I've done some cases for that, and I was court appointed in Yuma County.
Okay. And so when you're doing forensic work here in Arizona, who do you particularly work for, one side or the other, defense?
Most of the time I've been hired by the defense.
Okay. And when the defense hires you, well, let me ask you this. Have you ever turned down a case?
I've turned down a few cases when I felt that I couldn't help them. And sometimes I would begin an evaluation by interviewing someone, and I could see I was not going to be able to help the attorney, and I would inform them of such. And then it was their option as to whether or not they wanted me to write a report or just stop the case to save money at that point.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I want to talk to you a little bit what you've done in this particular case for Jodi. Do you remember when you were hired?
Yes, I believe that I was hired prior to December 16th, 2009.
Okay. And when you're hired, what's your understanding of what you're supposed to do?
Well, first I discussed the case with the attorney. In this case, it was Mr. Nurmi. And he gave me a background of what had happened, asked me if I would be interested in the case, and I was. And then at some point thereafter, I had my first meeting with Ms. Arias.
All right.
And I went in, as I typically do, to get an overall global view. I have found that style has worked best for me in doing evaluations. I just don't do a linear reporting. I try to develop a rapport. I try to make the person feel comfortable with me, and I find that extracts the most accurate information.
Okay.
I did meet with Ms. Arias a dozen times.
12 times?
12 times
Okay.
over a 3-year period.
All right. In your first couple of meetings with her, you talked a little bit about how you take a global approach. Can you explain a little bit more what you mean? From a psychological standpoint?
Yes, I knew this was going to be difficult for her, and so I skirted around the actual events that created this issue. Found out a little background information about her. She told me the original story about the 2 intruders. I didn't push that point.
When you say you didn't push that point, you mean you didn't confront her about it?
I didn't confront her with it, no, not the first couple of times.
Okay.
And got that information, got some background information, tried to make her feel more comfortable with me. After all, I was a stranger, and I was asking her the most intimate details of her life. And so when you work in a clinical setting, you try to develop rapport with your clients and develop a sense of trust. And this is how I handle cases of this nature. when we have the opportunity to meet with the client over a period of time. And that's what I did.
Okay. And during these meetings, do you record what you're saying?
No, I never record.
Okay,
And the
what do you
reason
do?
for that is very clear. People are very reluctant to get their words recorded. And I used to do that when I did therapy, but that always inhibited a person. Very rarely do I record an interview session for that reason.
All right. Do you write down what people are saying?
I write down, the downside of not recording it is that you have to write very quickly. And sometimes a word or two is missed and I have to get it the next time I go in. But we had the luxury of several different visits. So what I refer to that as a process of successive approximations. And that's just the style that I've developed over the years.
Okay. And what type of conversations are you having? You mentioned not linear. So what does that mean to you when you're taking?
I basically ask her what's on her mind today, what would she like to talk about. I usually have my agenda, some areas that I want to explore, and I will get into those areas. If I had a question about the previous interaction, I will refine my questions and try to get out the information. And you can easily tell what's the most difficult for the individual because they skirt around that particular issue. And that allows me to develop an approach later on down the line.
Have you seen them yet?
To finally get that information.
Okay. After these meetings with Ms. Arias, do you eventually write a report?
Yes, eventually I write a report.
And is that report, what do you write that report on, based from?
Well, the report is a function of the interviews, a review of the case material, and in this case, it was voluminous. I read somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 pages of her diaries, which began either in junior high school or high school. I don't recall exactly. I reviewed the police reports. I looked at the crime scene photographs. I interviewed her, read some newspaper accounts, and then I administered a couple of psychological tests to help me with my diagnosis. The two tests that I chose to use were the Milan Clinical Multi-Axle Inventory, which is a standardized paper and pencil test that is scored by a computer algorithm. And I use it as a sort of a second opinion because I have no control over how it's going to be scored. And that provides an output, which I incorporated into my report.
Okay. And in your report, Dr. Samuel, so you're taking all of this information that you've read through, right? And then the information of meeting with Ms. Arias, you said. Do you use any clinical things? I don't know what the proper term, but the DSM-4, what?
Being trained in psychology, you tend to look at the world with a clinical eye. But yes, the idea for me here was to come up with a diagnosis. And so each time I spoke with her, I tried to refine certain areas. I tested hypotheses using the diagnostic and statistical manual as my guide. I also reviewed many raw footage of I think it was 48 hours or 20/20 program, and it interviews, the recordings of messages and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of information in this case. So putting that all together, I wrote my report.
Okay. And you talked about when you're taking notes that you have to write very fast.
I do, yeah.
And do your notes then, when you're going to write down your report, are you looking through all your notes?
Yes, it's a little more difficult to do it than if I had done it in a linear fashion because I have to go back and forth and find out where a piece of information is. But that's just the way that I've been trained, and that's how I do it. It's not quite as efficient as some other methods, I guess.
And when you, as a psychologist, and when you're making a diagnosis, are specific dates, in particular to Ms. Arias' case, are specific dates important to you?
Sometimes they are, but most of the time the specific details and dates aren't quite as important. Obviously, dates surrounding the primary event are important, but a day or two off usually doesn't matter that much to me. Now, it may to a detective, but it doesn't affect me that much.
Okay, and is that part of the global take that you do?
That's right. It's a global approach.
Okay. And after you finished your report, did you ever make an addendum?
I did.
And what was that for?
The addendum was made because new information came to light from, I believe, a hard drive and some letters that was in question. So I reviewed that material and I wrote an addendum to my report, because at the time that I wrote the report, I did not have that new material.
All right. All right, and in that addendum, did you change your opinion at all?
No, it reinforced my opinion.
All right, and when you have additional information, is it important for you to look at that additional information in forming an opinion?
Absolutely. The more pieces of the puzzle you have, the more complete the image.
Okay. You mentioned that when you first met Ms. Arias that she was talking about the intruder story.
Yes.
Okay, and you said you didn't confront her about that?
Not initially, no.
Why, initially, why is that?
Well, that was a story, and I wanted to see if it would change at all, which it did not. And so Mr. Nurmi and I went to her and explained the importance of.
Well, let me stop you there.
Yes, okay.
Did you eventually confront her?
We did.
Okay, and during the time period that you saw her, did she eventually stop talking about the intruder story?
Yes.
All right, and then did she tell you what we now know, what she says happened on June 4th?
Yes.
Okay. And after she told you what happened on June 4th, did you ever feel the need to confront her again?
Not on that, no.
Okay.
No.
During the first sessions when you're talking to her, once she's telling you the intruder story, did you get the feeling that she wasn't being completely forthcoming?
Did I get the feeling she wasn't being forthcoming? I had suspicions that was the case, yes.
And is that
published
something
May
that
of
happens
2013,
when you
so-
meet somebody for the first time, a new patient for the first time?
I've
when
had
he did
patients that I've
this-
worked with for a year that haven't told
He
me the
met
whole
with her,
story.
it
So
wasn't.
yes, this is not at all unusual.
And is that part of establishing a rapport with her?
That's correct.
And when you
May 5th,
establish a rapport with someone,
2013.
is that something where, is that establishing a trust also?
Yes.
And let's see, when you first met Ms. Arias, what was she like as far as self-esteem, her confidence level?
Well, initially, and from the beginning, it became clear to me that she had some difficulties with.
That's my foundation. I know he said 41st, but then he said in the beginning, if we could just narrow it down to whatever time.
When you first met her in 2009?
I felt that she was a woman with low self-esteem. I saw her as relatively, pretty much of a pacifist, and I had read all of her writings by that point. I realized she was confused. I suspected that there was more to the story than she first revealed. And of course, that expressed some concern to me. In order to do a proper evaluation, you have to confront eventually stories that may seem to be improbable.
Okay. Did you notice any change in her self-esteem from then until more recently? And when
Yes.
I say more recently, for foundation's sake, let's talk about the end of last year.
Yes, the end of last year. I found her to be more confident and more in control of her feelings, more positive about her life. She was very depressed when I first met her, and she talked about suicide and so on. And so that depression seemed to have lifted to a large degree by the last time I had seen her.
Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about memory.
Sure.
Okay? You said that you have a degree, your degree is in biopsychology?
Biopsychology.
Okay. Does that have anything to do with the brain and physiological things?
Yes, I used to teach physiological psychology to undergraduates and graduate students at various times. In more recent years, the past 6 years or so, I was the director of cognitive science for a company called Brain Savers. And that is a company that was developed by neurologist Paul Benheim, who is here in
at
Arizona
that.
to provide
Looks weird.
educational programs and cognitive exercise programs for the elderly in the nursing homes. And I've had an interest in that for many, many years. We actually put together a book that Dr. Benheim authored, in which we wrote rather clearly, but in a simplistic way, about the functioning of the brain, the formation of memories, how memories can be distorted, how they cannot form. And so that way I have enhanced my ability to converse about the human brain and memory.
All right. And I'm sorry, you said that you also taught?
Yes, I taught at the New Jersey Medical School. I taught at the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology. I taught at the City University of New York.
Okay.
At various times.
Okay. And just a degree in psychology itself, do you learn anything about the brain with psychology?
Yes, absolutely. It's part of the curriculum because after all, what is behavior but the function, the expression of what goes on in the brain? So that's core to psychology. In fact, psychology is considered the study of behavior, and behavior emanates from the brain. So obviously we need to know it. We don't treat brain disorders, but we help people with an understanding of how the brain functions.
Okay. Judge, may we approach?
May.
And Dr. Sanders, did you put together a PowerPoint with slides to help us understand the
Yes.
function of memory?
Yes.
And do you think that PowerPoint, the pictures, will that assist the jury in understanding your explanation of how memory works?
I would hope so, otherwise I wouldn't be doing my job as an educator.
All right. If I can just have a moment, Judge.
Ladies and gentlemen, with regard to the PowerPoint presentation, you may consider the PowerPoint presentation during the testimony of this witness. It is being provided to assist you in understanding his testimony. You will not receive a copy of the PowerPoint presentation to take with you into the jury room when you deliberate.
Can you tell me Dr. Sanders, how to get the password on this computer?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
All right, Judge, may I publish it to the jury? Thank you. I think we're missing, oh. All right, can you tell us, you want to tell us a little bit about how our memory works and how it's formed?
Yes. The human brain is an incredibly complex organ. And in the last 10 or 15 years, neuroscientists have undergone an enormous amount of research to the point where we're now beginning to understand how memories are formed, how they're stored, how they're transformed. We still have a long way to go, but we do know enough that I can make statements with certainty because this material is readily available in the literature and it is accepted as being factual to the point where our information and our knowledge stops. So what I have done here to clarify this for you is on this, yeah, there it is. Okay, on the screen is a cross-section of the brain. If I took my brain and sliced it this way, you would have an opportunity to see the different layers of the brain because the brain consists of many layers. These portions of the brain in this area here is referred to as the old brain because all vertebrates, which means snakes, reptiles, amphibians, crocodiles, birds, monkeys, dogs, cats, and human beings all have this same, very similar, these same structures. These structures form the basis of our emotions, which occurs in the amygdala. In the hippocampus is where memories are formed. The reason that it looks like, the reason that we call it a hippocampus is that Greek scientists noted, even back then, that the structure inside of the brain looked like a seahorse. And so hippocampus means seahorse in Greek. And scientific studies now show that the amygdala is the center of emotion, that all the emotions that we have are mediated in this very small section of the brain, deep within the size of the inside of the brain. Whereas the hippocampus, which we see here, is where memories are stored. How do we know that? We know that because in people with injuries or in animal studies where those areas are deliberately damaged, new memories are very difficult, if not impossible, to form. An animal won't learn the task. People with Alzheimer's disease show a shrinkage of the hippocampus. And we believe that that's why they don't remember recent things, whereas things that they remembered years and years ago, which have already been coded and stored somewhere else in the brain, have no difficulty being retrieved. Now, the difference between the human brain is that we have a lot of what's called the gray matter. This is the cerebral cortex. We're not interested in that today, but the cerebral cortex is where reasoning occurs, where inspiration occurs, where our language takes place, and so on. But we're mainly concerned here. We know that the hippocampus is extremely sensitive to stress. And when the hippocampus is not operating correctly, memories cannot be formed. Stress occurs in situations that we call fight or flight. If you've ever been in a car where you had a near miss, or you've had a car accident, or God forbid something even worse than that, some sort of an accident or a real tragedy, you know the feelings of your heart beginning to pound away. You know that you might feel hot or even cold and clammy. Your respiration begins to increase. This is a result of stress impacting on the brain, primarily first through the amygdala, which is here, seat of emotion, which also will have effect on your ability to remember things that occurred during that period of time.
Can you tell us a little bit about the physiological aspects? So what happens when you talk, let's say, stick with a car accident. What happens is our physiological changes.
Well, perhaps I can refer to the article.
Let me talk a little bit more. Let's talk a little bit more first about the amygdala. Does it do something? You were talking about having cold sweats or having that feeling where your arms get heavy right after an adrenaline rush. Yes. What causes that? Okay, what happens is that when we sense danger, an automatic protective system begins to occur. And we call that as the body is going from what's called a parasympathetic state, which is a state that body is in when we're calm, to a sympathetic state, which is what's referred to as the fight or flight state, where the body prepares to fend off harm, to protect itself, to survive, most important thing. You see this in animals and you see this in humans as well. So what happens when the body goes into this mode?
Well, first of all, the amygdala releases a whole bunch of hormones, which begins to put the body into a protective mode. Glucose is released to power the major muscle areas for self-defense and for running. That's why we call it fear or fight or flight. So the muscle groups get energized. Adrenaline is pumped into the system, which improves our alertness and also adds to our ability for strength. We've all heard of people being able to do inhuman-like tasks. A woman whose child is crushed by a car lifts the car. We hear stories like that. And it's possible due to the additional glucose and due to the adrenaline pumping through the body. The problem that occurs for the hippocampus is that the presence of the adrenaline begins to shut this area down because the brain is not interested in remembering what's going on. The brain is interested in survival. And so all our energies are focused on self-protection. We don't start thinking about, oh, what a beautiful color my attacker is wearing. We don't think about that. We don't think about, what song I would like to have played at my funeral. We don't think about that. We simply, we fight for our lives or we flee from the scene. That's all that happens, whether you're a rat, an alligator, or a human being. It's the same thing that happens.
So are you saying that there's a I just lost it. Are you saying that there's a physiological reason, these chemicals that are flooding from the amygdala to the hippocampus? So is that something that can ever be controlled?
No, it can't be controlled. It's part of our built-in protective system. And I'm sure it has helped to propagate the species over the eons, We're very fortunate the system works that way.
And so with the hippocampus shut down, then is that not, even though something is happening before our eyes, is it that it's not being retained?
That's correct. In fact, we know, and it's clear from the research, that a large percentage of individuals who are in such settings do not remember or have cloudy and foggy memories of what has transpired, because the brain is not able to process through the hippocampus that information. We are more concerned with survival. And that's it. This happens in all creatures.
All right, Judge, may we approach?
You may. May continue.
Dr. Samuels, have you run into examples of this type of flooding, the amygdala and flooding in the hippocampus shutting down?
Oh, yes.
And have you had examples from your own practice, working with police officers?
Well, definitely. With the police officers that I've worked with, many of them cannot recall the details of the shooting incident or when they were under fire. But that's not unusual. People who suffer from stress-producing trauma will frequently not recall what happened for a certain period, starting at the beginning of the trauma until sometime thereafter, which could be measured either in hours or even days and sometimes even weeks.
And did you also run into another example of that in reading a Time magazine article?
I happened to be in physical therapy that day, and I was on my back and reading this article, and I said, wow, this is perfect to show how common this type of occurrence is.
All right, can we go to the next slide then?
Yes.
All right, can you explain what the article was about?
This article was actually written in reference to the gun violence situation. And they were talking about what happens to people who are under fire or are required to fire on other people, when we were talking about the possibility of arming people in the schools. And they're talking about a police academy trainer, someone with 10 years of experience, who went on a routine shoplifting case, and suddenly he saw the perpetrator pull out a gun. And the reporter did a particularly good job of describing what goes on inside the brain in terms that the average person can understand. So I thought that might be helpful for the jury to see what happens.
Nothing from it.
And this is very common.
So what does it tell us about what that particular police officer went through?
Well, as we were describing before, the sight of the gun, which was a stressful situation for him, sent a signal through the back of his brain, passed a message on to his amygdala, which controls the fear, and that sends out a flood of hormones into the brain. Now, although they're not talking about the hippocampus specifically here, it triggers a whole bunch of changes in the officer's body, preparing him to fight or flee.
Are you kidding
Blood
me?
vessels constrict, heart rate shot up, hormones charge through his system, which inject power to the muscle groups, and of course, I think I said the blood vessels constricted. So he is now set through a process that he had no control over whatsoever to either fight or flee.
And this article was talking about, this example is somebody who actually has experience.
That's the key. This man is a trained police officer who trains other police officers, and it happened to him.
Okay, can we go to the next slide?
Yes. The article continued, as happens for most people in life or death situations, the brain begins to manipulate the perception of time. People will very often say in a situation like that, my whole life passed before my eyes. Or I felt I was running, but everything seemed to be in slow motion. These are the normal occurrences that are caused by distortions to the brain, because the brain has actually been affected by all of these hormones, this flood of hormones going through the body. It changes our perception of things. In moments of stress, the brain doesn't allow us to contemplate. It doesn't allow us to reflect on this, to write a poem or to come up with a song. The only thing that happens is that the cerebral cortex, the part of the brain that makes us human, goes offline, leaving the functions to this old-fashioned, the old part of the brain shared by all vertebrates, fish included, and nothing else that you can do will reverse that until the fear is diminished and the hormones deplete from the body, from the brain. And typically, after an adrenaline rush, he noticed when he was in the ambulance, his body began to shake, a common occurrence in situations like this.
All right, and so for somebody who's a trained police officer, are you telling us that he had no control over these physiological responses?
We don't have control. When the old brain, our emotions take over, we don't have control. That's why sometimes people make very bad decisions regarding relationships because their emotions overpower their reasoning.
You may continue.
Okay, oh, back to the brain, perfect. Okay, so I want to talk to you about when we have these stressful situations, okay, and we have this physiological response that occurs that we can't help. And you talked about the hippocampus shutting down.
Yes.
Okay, so tell us about then memory.
Oh my
Do we have any
God,
control
who
over
the
trying to
hell
remember things during this
cares?
stressful period?
The hippocampus mediates all memory. If we did not have a hippocampus, well, probably there'd be some other organ that did the job, but if the hippocampus is damaged, and it, as I indicated to you earlier, in people with Alzheimer's disease, we can actually see a shrinkage of the hippocampus, which is another reason why people don't have good short-term memory when they get older, because the hippocampus is shrinking. And if the memories are not formed because
Not the
it's
size
shut
of the
down,
hippocampus, it's how you use
it's
it.
entirely possible and actually highly likely that someone will not be able to recall anything about a situation. Or if they do, it would be foggy or bits and pieces. But this is common, this is well known, and it's not really not arguable.
Okay, what about when you say memories formed, is it, I think of it as being implanted. Is that something, or is that not correct?
We really don't know. Honestly, to this day, we still don't know. We think maybe somehow memories, long-term, this is what happens. Short-term memories are formed in the hippocampus. And then over a period of days, including sleep, by the way, REM sleep, this rapid eye movement sleep, when our body twitches and so on, we notice it in our dogs and cats sometimes. It's during that period that these short-term memories from the hippocampus are converted into something, we're not exactly sure, and that are stored in long-term memory. We don't know how that's done. It may be coded in proteins, and the research is just beginning in that area. We do know, by the way, that memories are not encoded in one place in the brain, but they seem to be globally distributed. It's almost like a RAID computer system.
Diagnosed with ADHD.
The data is distributed.
Okay, so if the hippocampus isn't working, does that mean that the short-term memories aren't there to be able to be coded and sent out?
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. We've heard that Ms. Arias described it like being in a fog with regard to her memory. When we talk about these memory issues with the hippocampus not working, are we talking about just memory, or does this go to how a person is capable of doing things like driving a car?
We during the period of the fight or flight reaction, the things that we maintain control over are either fighting back a perceived danger or fleeing the scene. What happens or which one occurs is not clear. We don't know how, why or how that happens. I guess it's circumstances to some degree. But once a person enters this state, while the memories are not being formed, any activities that are involved in fleeing seem to be able to occur, such as running away, or getting into a car and driving away, or getting on a horse and trotting away. So it seems very specific to the development of new memories. Some parts of the brain still continue in an almost automatic fashion. And that's how we survive.
All right, so when we talk about this memory or this fogginess going on, then people are certainly able to drive a car, you're saying?
Yes, it's very possible, sure.
And they don't just become like a zombie then?
No, some people might,
Okay.
but I don't think most people do.
Okay, and is that the purpose of the brain, so that the survival instinct?
Yes.
That we can still function?
That we can still survive and reproduce ourselves.
Okay. Now what, in these high stress situations, let's say you take a car accident again, this fight or flight type situation. how fast are things going on in a person's brain at that point?
Well, things go on in real time, but a person's perception of how long things are going on can change. Many people report that time seems to slow down. And I'm sure many of you have either read that or heard about it, or maybe even experienced yourselves. Time seems to slow down. Person's running down a corridor, but it seems like it's forever to get there. We know that time is a experience that can be influenced by various things, various chemical changes, including drugs, can slow down or even speed up the perception of time.
Okay, but in reality, that doesn't mean that the person actually has any more time to think.
That's correct.
Did you ever do any work with hypnosis and trying to recover memories?
Yes, with the police department, I have some advanced training in hypnosis, used to teach hypnosis. But I would be asked by the police department to try to help the officers remember details of what had transpired because they didn't remember it. And most of the time we failed. Hypnosis can be helpful if there's something there that's being psychologically repressed. And then maybe we can release some of that repression. But if the memories aren't there, they ain't there.
So even with hypnosis, you can't get it. You can't, there's no memory to get.
If there's nothing there, there's nothing to get.
There you go.
Okay.
Because why?
I want to talk to you a little bit about memory of things not under stressful situations, okay? You mentioned that you read through Jodi's journals.
Yes.
And you said they started from when?
Either junior high school or high school.
Okay, so younger, when she was a
When she
teenager?
was quite young, yes.
And does it help our memories when people write things down?
Absolutely.
Objection, my recommendation, also speculation as to what the defendant's memory was back then. She couched it in terms of Miss Arias. He can't know what her memory was. No one can.
I said our memories. Does it help our memories?
No,
All right. I'm going to ask that you rephrase your question to clarify.
All right. To clarify, doctor, I'm talking generally speaking. When people write things down, does it help to remember them?
It does. When I was a graduate student, before we had these, recorders on our cell phones, I would listen to the conversation, the lecture, and I would write it down, even if I thought I could remember, and my memory was better then than it is now. But when you write it down, two more things happen. Not only do you hear it, but you're also imprinting the movement of your handwriting, which is another layer of learning. And when you're transposing it and you see it, you're adding yet another layer of association. So the best way for someone to learn is to expose yourself to as many senses as you can simultaneously. And that's one way that you can actually improve your memory. So the fact that things were written down likely improved her ability to remember them.
as lack of foundation, speculation as to Miss Arias' memory, he said, likely improved her memory was the phrase.
You want to respond?
Judge, he's talking about people's memories, and I think he's certainly qualified to discuss what memory can do when things are written down.
Clarify that he's speaking in general.
He's not qualified to discuss his own memory.
Dr. Samuels, generally speaking, if somebody keeps a journal or a diary and they write down their daily activities, okay? Generally speaking, does that help the person if they were to review their diary years later? Does it help that person to remember what occurred what that person wrote down?
Absolutely. In fact, in this book, The Brain Training Revolution, I was responsible for coming up with the exercises to help older people strengthen their brain. And one of the things was write down things you do, tell a story about what you're doing, use the written, use the auditory, use the visual, and that strengthens the memory. So that's well known.
Okay, so it's well known that just by writing it, it strengthens the memory?
Here,
That's the answer.
Overruled.
I'm sorry, go ahead,
the
Nancy.
more modalities we use simultaneously, the better. In fact, people who exercise while they're learning seem to be able to learn faster than people who are just sitting at a desk learning.
Interesting. All right, so let's
Oh,
talk
she just wanted a free
about
class.
Let's talk about something called acute stress.
Could you repeat that?
Acute stress.
Oh, acute stress, yes.
Can you tell us what acute stress is?
Yes.
in
Acute
ugly
stress
stress.
is a condition, and it's actually a DSM diagnosis, which is called an acute stress
Oh my gosh, he has the
disorder.
whole book. He brought the whole book, which I would like to throw at him. The whole book. All of it. Wow. Which is, as
Because
Judge
why?
Judy said.
Let me ask you
I
first.
don't know, Judge.
You're holding up a book that says DSM-4.
Yes.
Okay, can you tell us what DSM-4 is?
Okay. The American Psychiatric Association periodically puts together what's referred to as the Bible of Mental Health Disorders, which is used internationally. And a very large panel of experts in psychology and psychiatry get together maybe every 10 years or so to review the criteria for specific disorders. So if, for example, I say that someone has a bipolar 2 disorder, I'm not going to explain what that is. Somebody else
testified
on the
2
other
months
side of the
before the
globe will know
DSM-5
what
came out.
symptoms they have, what is its etiology is, so we know we're talking about the same process. So in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, amongst the many diagnoses that exist is something called an acute stress disorder.
Okay, and what is acute stress disorder?
Acute stress disorder occurs when someone is in a state of acute distress, psychologically or physically, because of the fact that it impacts the body in a physiological manner, as I indicated before, which produces certain behavioral and psychological effects on that individual. And the criteria for that are fairly clearly laid.
Can I just tell you that the difference, I was looking at the differences right now. When you see me looking over here, it's because I'm looking up something that he has said or just trying to figure things out. And I was looking up the differences between DSM-4 and 5, and the very first difference is the elimination of the multi-axial system and the GAF score or GAF score. And the inventory that he had her do was Milan, whatever, clinical multi-axial inventory. So 2 months later, DSM got rid of the multi-axial system, assuming that that's the exact is what that means. It looks like it is, but how fascinating, huh? How fascinating.
Laid out in the book. And
Just have a remark. He keeps referring to the book. Brett, I may need it.
Yes, we will do that at the break. You may continue.
And again, this is Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And we can then say, if this person has these criteria, which have been laid down by these learned people and is approved worldwide, then likely we can use that label for that person and describe their problems as having the particular diagnosis.
Okay, all right, so, and is this the DSM-4, is this something, well, 4 is just the revision, right?
There
The
was a
level.
DSM-2, there was a DSM-3, there was a DSM-4, and there was a DSM-4-TR, text revision. This
Same
is
with
the
the
original, this is the one I
gender
bought a long time ago. And the reason I don't use the text
Sexual
revision one is that
disorders,
it's meaningful to me.
which they changed in
But
DSM-5.
other than describing some of the things in different language, it's exactly the same. DSM-5 will be out within 8 months or so. So then this gets pushed aside and we have to learn the diagnostic categories of the new one.
Okay, all right.
There you
So
go.
talking about
At least
acute
he said
stress,
it.
when does acute stress happen?
Acute stress usually happens in reaction to something in the environment that produces either psychological or physiological stress for the individual. Stress being defined as a condition where we feel anxious, where the amygdala kicks in, and we begin to feel a shortness of breath, or our heart begins to pound, or we begin to sweat, those kinds of symptoms.
Okay, so something that would be considered like a trauma, something very
Something
stressful?
very severe, some very severe trauma, yes.
I'm
All
gonna
right,
bite my
and-
pillow. It's what I'm gonna do.
How does it happen?
Well, what happens is, just as I described earlier, a condition occurs, the amygdala sends out signals and hormones to different parts of the brain. the body goes into a fight or flight reaction, and we are then in a period of stress, the symptoms of which I've described.
Okay. Did you prepare PowerPoint slides to help explain what acute stress is and the amnesia part of it?
Well, actually, yes, the amnesia part I did.
Okay. All right. And Judge, may I demonstrate that to the jury?
Yes.
Is it just me, or is he like the
All right.
ridiculous doctor?
When we talk about
that
acute
just
stress, and it
that case?
floods the amygdala, floods the hippocampus.
Project to the slide as amnesia and
That guy.
crime, since
Doctor,
it's vouching.
Judge, it's the title of the article that Dr. Samuels relies on.
All right, establish that fact.
I will. There. When we talk about the hip.
Kirk's face is amazing. Let's go back a second. Just watch Kirk smile. Oh man, so good.
It's vouching.
Judge, it's the title of the article that Dr. Samuels relies on.
All right, establish that fact.
I will. There. When we talk about the hippocampus shutting down and no memories forming, does that, you're saying, does that happen
I don't
during
know why
acute
it's so
stress?
funny
Yes.
to me.
Okay. And is there research about this?
There's a lot of research about this.
All right. And when that happens, is there different types? What's amnesia?
Amnesia is a condition where a period of time, in terms of memory, is lost. Now, there are different kinds of amnesias. Some amnesias can last for a few hours. Some amnesias can last for years. There are some amnesias that are
Is that better?
associated with criminality. And so these articles are an attempt to study these and understand the relationships between the formation of these amnesias, which again, we'll have some data to look at. And because what happens is that the presence of amnesia in people who have suffered from an acute stress disorder is fairly high. And so that's why we have these articles here.
Okay, and just one more question before I show the slide. Typically, not being a psychologist, when I think of amnesia, I'm thinking we forget everything. Is that the correct way to think of amnesia in a clinical setting?
No, some amnesias are very, very specific. Now, those are called psychogenic amnesias. We're not talking about that today.
Okay,
We're talking about the stress-induced amnesia that occurs because the hippocampus is shut down because the individual was in an acute stress reaction and the brain has been flooded by chemicals that do not allow the memories to form.
all right.
That's what we're talking about here.
All right, should we go to the first slide?
Sure.
All right. And is this an article that you relied upon?
This is an article that I relied upon for my
All right.
testimony.
All right, and can you tell us what are we discussing?
Without going into the very details, we refer to dissociative amnesia.
Why not?
We used to call it
Because you can't?
psychogenic amnesia or functional amnesia because it was considered at that point to be purely psychological. But now we know.
Wait a second. So he had called it psychogenic or whatever, amnesia. And then when he saw this article, he backtracked and said it used to be called this. And this is why. Is that what happened? Did I miss this? Hold on.
Amnesia. We used to call it psychogenic
Yep. Sure
amnesia
did. That's
or functional
exactly what
amnesia
happened.
because it was considered at that point to be purely psychological. But now we know there's probably nothing that's really purely psychological because everything psychological is mediated by chemicals in our brain. So with that new research and understanding, we don't use that term psychogenic amnesia anymore. So we call it a dissociative
just
state
did.
where what we remember is disconnected from what actually went on. And it's characterized by an inability to remember an important experience or event after a
that's
traumatic
good.
experience of psychological origin. That's the
Multi-axial, that
definition of
confuses
it.
me. If they kick
The
it out of the
person- I'm sorry.
DSM.
Oh, I was going to say, and what happens to a person who's
What if it's
suffering from
updated
dissociative
then?
amnesia?
They don't remember, they don't remember anything.
Thank you,
or only
Adam.
bits and pieces of what happened from the time the trauma began until sometime thereafter.
Judge, I don't think it was established. Did he establish that that was the name of the article, Amnesia and Crime? I don't think that was asked.
Yes, I asked if this was an article that he relied upon.
No, but is that the title?
What was the title of the article that you relied upon?
Amnesia and crime.
Thank you. And what happens, there's a paragraph talking about detachment. What's detachment?
Detachment is an altered state of consciousness where the person feels disconnected from oneself and from the external world. In other words, nothing exists except their inner processes. They are detached from the outside world, and that is something that can exist for either minutes, hours, or even days.
And detachment, if somebody's going through detachment, does that mean that are they physically capable of being? I mean, are they able to still do things?
Yes, they can.
Okay. All right. Anything else about this particular article?
No, this was just the first of, should I go on to the next
Yes,
one?
go on to the next one,
Okay.
please.
Now, this is in the same article.
Yes, okay. In the same
Amnesia and
article.
crime. I just needed more room.
All right. Okay,
Okay.
go ahead.
It says that dissociative amnesia may result when detachment interferes.
You may. All right. We're talking about dissociative amnesia.
Yes.
All right. And you said, hey, I'm sorry, how long can it last?
Dissociative amnesia can last anywhere from minutes to hours to days to weeks to months for a lifetime.
All right. And something that I want to clarify, when you say it can last, does that mean that for a lifetime a person may not recall what happened during a certain time period, or that they're not able to form memories for a lifetime?
No, they don't recall what happened during that time frame. Their ability to form memories generally comes back as long as there's no physical damage to the hippocampus.
Okay. All right. And with regard to transient amnesic syndromes, that's the next slide. Is that the title?
Yes.
Of the article that you relied upon?
Yes.
Okay. And can you tell us what this article has to say?
Basically, it says that temporally circumscribed amnesia, which means time-limited amnesia, amnesia for one period from the starting point to the end point, whatever that is associated with a specific and unusually emotionally charged event, such as a criminal offense. Now, the interesting thing is that the data shows that the proportion of amnesia is proportional to the violence of the offense. And up to 30% of convicted homicide cases have amnesia claimed at trial. There's a typo there that I missed. It says it claimed at trial. It should be claimed at trial.
Okay. So tell us what that means in layman's terms.
Well, that means that perpetrators, it's been well shown, it's been established that perpetrators of horrible crimes can also develop post-traumatic stress disorder for having acted as the source of the crime. For example, our soldiers in Afghanistan report post-traumatic stress disorder because they were involved in the killing of the enemy. Police officers, people that I've treated, who shoot a victim either accidentally or on purpose, deliberately in the line of duty, also can develop post-traumatic stress disorder. Not all of them do. Some of them do, not all of them. Some of them develop amnesia, some of them don't. But what it's saying here is that up to 30%, and this is a study of several different studies, of up to 30% of convicted homicide cases claim to have amnesia at their trial. What's interesting is that this type of amnesia tends to affect younger people more than older people, especially in the third and fourth decade of life, in the 20s and in the 30s.
Okay. All right. And so we were talking about acute stress. How does this figure in with acute stress?
Well, acute stress is what causes the breakdown of the hippocampus's ability to store memories and is responsible for the transient amnesia because the memories aren't formed. It affects some people more than others, but 30%, up to 30%, is quite a large proportion to experience this type of event.
Okay. And is there another slide?
Yes.
All right. The title, Transient Global Amnesia.
Functional anatomy and clinical implications.
All right. And what does this article tell you?
This is saying that now we're not looking at a criminal population. We're looking at the general population. In the general population, somewhere between, different studies come up with different numbers. So between 3 and 8 people per 100,000 people each year experience transient global amnesia. The amazing thing is that here are the things that can cause that. sudden immersion or in cold or hot water, physical exertion, emotional or psychological stress, pain, medical procedures, sexual intercourse, and similar events have been observed in 50 to 90% of these documents.
There's a problem when that's a different article, but the article that I had linked here, that there's a problem when the article's published in 2007, and since then, I mean, for an article called Amnesia and Crime, since then it looks like it's only been cited by others like 7 times. So, not impressed. I haven't read it though, so you know, I withhold judgment until I read it.
Attacks of transient global amnesia. So you don't have to be in a horrible situation, but an everyday situation, and you're still prone to having this transient global amnesia.
Does that mean, so let's take the immersion in hot or cold water. Does that mean somebody won't remember being immersed?
It clouds, apparently that's been reported for people who have a lack of memory for having been immersed in the hot or cold. I don't know how they get into the hot or cold water. I didn't look at the details of the study, but yeah, that they don't remember the beginning to sometime at the end when their capacity for recollection begins to return. Will they ever remember anything? Maybe, maybe not.
All right. And as a person's capacity to remember starts to come back, okay, how does it come back? Is it just back, or is it something that is developed over time?
Usually, if it comes back, it begins to restore itself over a period of time. But there are many people that never remember the actual events. Depends on many factors. We don't know what all those factors are. We think it has to do with the intensity of the act, the degree of the shock, the duration of the shock, and so on and so forth. But I'm just presenting data here.
Yeah, okay, here's my question.
Sure.
Is when the stressful situation has ended, okay? And so the hippocampus is now that the flood is receding, and so the hippocampus is starting to be able to work again.
That's correct.
Okay. When the hippocampus starts to be able to work again, is it something where a person's memory just starts immediately?
No, it more likely would begin to return gradually. Okay. In other words, it may have a sudden termination when the trauma begins, but more likely it has a gradual restoration to normalcy towards the end. All
right. And when you talk about gradual, what did you say? Gradual normalization?
Gradual restoration towards normalcy means that new memories can.
I think he was buffering just then.
Gradually be reformed. They don't get back what's gone.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So if they're gradually reforming new memories, does that mean that their memory would be somewhat, what we would say, general population people say, spotty?
For that transitional period, their memories may be spotty, yes.
Okay. So, and you were moving your hand up and down before. What does that mean?
I didn't even realize that. Basically, I was showing that there is a gradual restoration to normalcy. Let's say that the normal level of memory capability is here. It's repressed here due to the stress. It gradually comes back over a period of time.
Okay.
And it's not linear either. It goes up and down and, maybe sporadic over that period of time.
Okay. And so since it's not linear or sporadic, as you say, does that mean that somebody might remember from the time of the stressful period when the hippocampus then starts to work again till the time that their memory is considered somewhat normal? In between that time, does that mean that they might remember certain things and not remember others?
Yes, that would be predicted.
And because it goes up and down, does that mean that they could remember certain things closer to the stressful event, but not remember things further away
from
the stressful?
Not today, Satan.
Okay.
Not
and
today.
by the way, it's hard to predict an individual with that information, but we do know that's what happens.
And I'm not asking individually, just generally speaking?
Only speaking generally.
Right? Okay. All right, is there another slide?
I think there was one more. I just wanted to reemphasize that this article is from the article, The Stressed Hippocampus, Synaptic Plasticity and Lost Memories. And basically the message I wanted to share with the jury is extensive rodent and animal and human research has shown that the hippocampus is not only crucially involved in memory formation, but it is also highly sensitive to stress, pointing out again that memories are not formed in many people who have experienced acute stress.
Unnecessary, sir.
Because chemically, it just doesn't work.
And you say chemically, and that's, again, we're talking
The
about.
hormones, the adrenaline, the other hormones, and so on.
Okay, so, and when you say it just doesn't work, does that mean physically speaking, it's just not possible at times?
That's correct.
All right. All right, a little bit more about acute stress. Give me a second.
No, you can't have a second.
How long can acute stress last?
Well, acute stress can last, long-term mild stress overall can be bad for people, sometimes almost as bad as a short duration intense stress. So we know that in order to live longer, one should lead a less stressful life. We know about that. And we do that
dude, guys,
by
I have like 2
exercise,
years
eating
left.
right, and so on.
If that's the case,
But
I have
acute
2 years left.
short-term stress is something that usually occurs over a relatively short period of time. The body just can't handle it for much longer periods, either physically or if there's an attack, they may be knocked out or killed or whatever. But the diagnosis of acute stress disorder can only be used for up to a couple of months, because at that point, most acute stress has dissipated, and we then have to shift to a different diagnosis.
Okay. And can acute stress be diagnosed? When can acute stress be diagnosed?
Within 2 months of the onset of the event,
Okay,
of the
so,
stressful event.
all right. So it would have to be close in time. Does the person have to be suffering from acute stress at the time for you to be able to diagnose them?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay.
Because there are certain symptoms that exist during that period that are signs that that's the correct diagnosis.
Okay. And during acute stress, you said it can last for up to a couple months.
Well, you can use the diagnosis for up to a couple of months. It usually doesn't last quite as long.
Okay. And is there a general period of time thought?
Well, a week, 2 weeks, maybe that intense period, a few hours very often, sometimes a few minutes.
Okay.
But it's not a long-term thing. It's a relatively intense and short duration.
All right. And during this intense and short duration, can a person suffer from memory gaps?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And is that due to everything we learned about the hippocampus?
The hippocampus and the amnesia that follows.
Okay. All right. I want to talk to you about specifically about your evaluation with regard to Miss Arias.
Okay.
And I have. I have exhibit number 525, which is just a copy.
Yes, that is. You want that?
What?
No, I asked the judge if you wanted it.
Objection,
All
gross
right.
over
Did you do any
general-
testing with Miss Arias?
I did.
Don't
And
say big
you had
words
told
if
us that
that's
you've met
enough.
with her for over 12 different
Gross
periods, 12
overgeneralization.
different times?
Yes,
All right. And during some of those times, did you give her certain tests?
I did.
What tests did you give her?
I administered 2 psychological tests.
All right. And which are those?
I administered the Milan Clinical Multi-Axle Inventory 3rd revision.
All right. And what else?
And then I administered to her the
Oh, you don't know?
post-traumatic stress disorder test.
Okay. Let's talk about the post-traumatic stress disorder test. Can you tell us specifically what it is?
Yes. Actually, it's a post-traumatic stress diagnostic scale. I knew there was something wrong there.
Sorry, post-traumatic
PTSD.
stress diagnostic scale.
This is a test that was developed by a well-known psychologist, and it is available commercially. It is designed to detect in a relatively short period of time the presence or absence of a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder to conform with the diagnostic criteria as outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So it's basically a confirmation of this diagnostic
Reporter's like,
category.
really?
Okay, so
We're
let me
doing
ask you
this
this.
right
As a
now?
psychologist, you have the DSM,
Yes.
and when you're meeting with somebody, do you form hypotheses about what you think their diagnosis might be?
Yes.
And do you do that based on the criteria that you see in the DSM?
Not initially. You
Okay.
get a feeling for what's going on, and you begin to remember, oh, this person's having this reaction, having this reaction. Let me see a little more closely. Then you might go through the specific criteria after reviewing the notes and spending more time with them and so forth.
And is that something that, with experience, is that these feelings that you get after meeting with people, is that something that experience helps you with as well?
Absolutely, absolutely.
All right.
I
Is
mean,
that
I've been
something?
doing this work for a long, long time.
Okay. All right. And so this particular test then, does it use the criteria that's in the DSM?
Yes, both the
So, they're kind of the same. Well, keep playing. I'm gonna find an answer
non-clinical
for you.
multi-axis inventory, which is a general personality test. I use that one because it's also geared to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And this test, the Post-Traumatic Stress Diagnostic Scale, also conforms to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So because I suspected that they may have been post-traumatic stress disorder, and because I got indications on the Milan test that they were, I then decided to give this test, and that confirmed the presence of a post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay. All right. So that's why you picked that particular test.
Yes.
Does that explain it? How does the test actually work?
Well, it's I think 49 items, an individual.
Mark, please.
Yes, we'll have it marked as an exhibit.
I do need this back.
Because I can't do it without it.
Thanks.
Is it okay if it's stapled on the back?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah. So the one he gave Jodi was developed as an alternative
All
to the
right.
Minnesota
This exhibit
Multiphasic
marked for
Personality Inventory, which was
Exhibit
given to
527, you're
Amber
referring to
Heard.
it?
Yes,
Is that the actual test?
this is the manual that comes with it. The test is reproduced within. Basically, it consists of
They have
about 49
similar
different
structures.
items. The individual checks off the items that are relevant to them.
There's not a
And
huge
then
difference.
it can either be computer scored, which I did not use. I used a hand scoring model. I don't do that many of these. So I don't have the computer program. And then you get a section where you check off whether these particular variables meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. And if they all do along the bottom of the test, then you say that the person has reaches the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. There's also another indication for the severity of the post-traumatic, and the other variable is whether it's an acute or a chronic type of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay. So when you're giving this test to somebody, obviously the person is writing their own answers.
Yes, they fill in little circles.
All right. So does that mean, can this test be manipulated by people?
Sure.
To fake the answer?
Sure, absolutely.
And is that something that's easy to
I didn't
do?
come here to
No,
hippo
not in
campus,
this test,
sir.
unless the person has read the manual, understands the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, and is in their mind trying to prove to someone that they do suffer from that disorder. This is not that well known.
She was
This is
writing
not
that dude
in
that
every
we talked about
psychologist's office.
The other
Okay.
night.
So in other words,
While
would the
she
person
was in
have to be
court.
very familiar with the test and PTSD itself to try and fake the answers?
Yes,
You told us, I think already, that this particular test confirms your hypothesis?
yes.
And your hypothesis, well, what did it confirm for you?
Well, it confirmed that she did suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder.
All right. And how is it that well,
It confirms
I
that
guess
she's
before-
able
I
to
guess before
manipulate the
that,
test to say what she wants it to.
before that, let's talk about your other test, the MCMI.
Sure.
Okay. What test is that?
That, again, is a Milan Clinical Multi-Axis Inventory Test, third revision. It's a well-recognized and frequently used test to measure personality. And the diagnostic categories that are suggested by it conform also to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
All right, and how is this test scored?
This test is 175 items to which you answer true or false. It is also scored by a very complex computer-based algorithm, too complicated to be almost impossible to do by hand. And so I send that test out to a professional scoring service that sent back the results. And and I consider that to be like a second opinion, because I may have an idea of something and a second psychologist has not interviewed the individual. And so this is the closest I can get to a second opinion without having to bring on another professional.
All right.
And it comes up with some diagnostic categories. It also comes up with some graphs and charts. And by analyzing the data that was presented to me, it confirmed that my suspicion was likely.
Do not let him run this
suffer from
direct.
post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, and on this particular test, is there anything built into the test to indicate its
Pants
accuracy?
on fire.
Yes, there are scales there that are referred to as
EOF.
lie scales, validity scales, consistency scales, and she seemed to do fine on all of those.
And do those scales, does that somehow try to report whether or not it appears that the person is trying to fake the answers?
That's correct.
All right. And with regard to Miss Arias, did you say
And
that
it failed.
her scores were showing valid?
Yes, the printout indicated that this was a valid result and that she appeared to respond in an accurate and honest manner.
Okay.
How does the computer know?
All right.
True or
So
false? You pick one.
based on these two tests and your meetings with Miss Arias, you say you formed the opinion that she has PTSD. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about PTSD.
Sure.
Okay. What is it?
Well, it's an anxiety disorder. It has some specific characteristics that I was able to relate to the various criteria that are listed here in the book. And in my report, I refer to the particular specific criteria that my study indicated Jodi, Miss Arias, meets the particular criteria. And based on that and the confirmation from the two tests led me to feel very comfortable using the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. What it means is that an individual has a stress-related disorder that involves certain characteristics that are seen over and over again in people who are similarly diagnosed. There may be a sense of detachment. There may be emotional blunting. There may be intrusive thoughts.
Okay, let me stop you there. What's detachment?
Detachment is when a person is not quite in contact with reality. It's not psychosis, but they may be in an extreme state of denial. They may not be able to deal with certain issues. That's part of one of the characteristics.
All right, and what was the second one that you said?
Another characteristic would be an
blunting.
emotional blunting,
Okay, what's that?
when their emotional range is very constricted. The normal affect that we have, the highs and the lows that most people are able to present, except if you're obviously very depressed or whatever, then it's hard to do that, is restricted. So there's a very narrow range of emotions. A person may appear to be flat and emotionless. That's another characteristic.
All right.
And there are a lot, and I can read them for you if you want me to do that, and they're in my report.
We'll get into that,
Into
I
that
think,
later.
specific to Jodi. With PTSD, so you're saying that it's something that is contained, PTSD, the
And
diagnosis
with
itself is
PTSD.
contained in the DSM.
Yes,
All right, so there are specific criteria, what you're just talking about.
that's right.
And in order to diagnose somebody, do you have to have these specific criteria?
You have to have a certain number of them. It's very specific. You have to have 3 out of 10, and then in one category, and then maybe 5 out of 6 in another category, and so on and so forth. And you just basically compare your notes, your decisions, your conclusions with those various criteria. And if the person meets enough of them, they got the diagnosis.
All right, Dr. Samuels, we stopped just when we started to talk about PTSD. Can we talk about the criteria, the general criteria for a PTSD?
Yes. The criteria are actually fairly specific.
Okay.
And I'd like to just read them from the book, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Accuracy.
All right, and
No,
that's
sir.
the DSM-4.
This is the DSM-4.
Can you tell us on the green tag what number it is?
Yes, it has been entered as Exhibit 528.
Okay, it's marked as Exhibit 528. All right, go ahead, and you're going to tell us what the criteria, specific criteria are for PTSD.
Okay, so when you go through these criteria, they're very, very specific. And so you compare these criteria to what you have learned from interview, from the crime scene reports, if you're dealing with a criminal case, from the psychological testing and so forth. The person has been exposed to a traumatic event in which both of the following were present. 1, the person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury or threat to the physical integrity of self or others, period. 2, the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. And then they go on to explain for children it's a little different, but that's not relevant here.
All right.
B,
Go ahead.
the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in one or more of the following ways. So of the 5 that I'll read, at least one of them has to be present. Recurrent or intrusive distressing recollections of the event, including images, thoughts, or perceptions. 2,
He doesn't remember.
recurrent distressing dreams of the event. 3, acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were reoccurring, includes a
Nope.
sense of reliving the experience, illusions, hallucinations, and dissociative flashback episodes, including those that occur on awakening or when intoxicated.
Nope.
4, intense psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. And 5, psychological reactivity on exposure to internal or external cues
She's
that
going back through
symbolize
her
or resemble
testimony
an
to see if she
aspect of the
fulfilled any of
traumatic
this
event.
stuff while she
So
was
that's
on
not
the
all.
stand.
C,
Wait, I'm
persist-
sorry, let me ask you.
Okay.
So one of those things has to be present?
at least one of those things has to be present.
Okay, and then another
One.
criteria?
C, persistent avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma and numbing of general responsiveness not present before the trauma is indicated by 3 or more of the following, and there's 7.
Okay.
Efforts to avoid thoughts, feelings, or conversations associated with the trauma. 2, efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma. 3, inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. 4, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities.
2 hours
5,
later.
feeling of detachment or estrangement from others. 6, restricted range of affect, e.g., unable to have loving feelings. 7, a sense of a foreshortened future. Example, does not expect to have a career, marriage, children, or a normal lifespan. And finally, D, 2 or more of the following, and there are 5. Persistent symptoms of increased arousal not present before the trauma, as indicated by 2 or more of the following. 1, difficulty falling or staying asleep. 2, irritability or outbursts of anger. 3, difficulty concentrating. 4, hypervigilance. 5, exaggerated startle response. So you go through these criteria and you compare that to the picture that's presented by the client, either through interview, other police records, et cetera, any psychiatric material if you have it, test results, and so forth.
Okay. And is this something that psychologists anywhere, if they were looking at a patient, they would be relying on these particular criteria?
That's correct.
All right. And with regard to PTSD, let's talk about your specific diagnosis then. What's specific to Jodi? Okay. And for that, do you need to refer to your report?
Yes.
Okay. Could you tell us what's the exhibit number on that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What's the exhibit number on your report?
What page?
Exhibit number.
Oh, exhibit number,
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's over here. 525.
Okay, and so the report, and you would take what you've learned about Miss Arias, if I understand this correctly,
Yes,
and compare it to the criteria in DSM.
that's correct.
All right, and the information that you learned from Miss Arias is coming from multiple sources, is that right?
Yes,
So is it more than what she told you?
yes,
And also based on the testing that you did?
yes.
Okay, all right, let's talk about the criteria. What's the first criteria that you found that relates to Miss Arias?
Hold on. Take me a second to get there. Criteria A1, which is as follows. The person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual or threatened death or serious injury or threat to the physical integrity of self or others.
Okay,
So it
and
doesn't
how does
matter who
that relate to
threatened
Miss
to?
Arias?
Well, she was involved in a homicide, and we have some data to show that perpetrators of violent crimes will frequently develop post-traumatic stress disorder from having been the initiator of such an event. We see that also in soldiers and police officers.
All right, and we'll talk about that in a second. So that's how you relate A1 to Miss Arias?
Yes.
Okay, what's the next criteria?
A2. The person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror.
Okay, and how does that relate to Miss
Horror.
Arias?
In describing her experiences, what she could remember, and the very fact that her defense mechanisms were built up so strongly that she couldn't confront the reality of what she did, I consider criteria A2 as having been met.
And what are you talking about that her defense mechanisms were built up so strongly? What are you talking about?
Well, I have a psychological theory as to describe why this story was created.
The intruder story?
The intruder story.
And then the story before that she wasn't there at all?
That's right.
Okay, and what's your psychological theory?
Well, we call it denial. It's a very intense form of denial where a person cannot deal with the fact that something they did was so opposite of everything else they stood for in life. I determined that by reading her diaries, primarily. And in her diaries, she is essentially a pacifist. And not a violent word, not a negative word. I didn't come across one negative word, statement, violent thought, or hostile thought in any of all of these writings that I read.
And let me just be specific. In these writings that you talk about, these are not just writings starting from 2006 to 2008, right?
These go back to either junior high or high school.
Okay. And so when you're talking about not a violent thought or things like that, is that also true for the writings that begin when she was a teenager?
Yes.
All right. And so how does that then help you to give us A2?
When a person engages in an activity that is the opposite of what they stand for, the horror of that all, the inability to accept what has happened, can create in one's mind a psychological wall between them and the reality of what happened. And that can occur by either denial that they were there or that it actually happened, and there was evidence that she pretended it didn't happen, or making up a story that was just the opposite of what happened to distance herself from that.
I always
So that to me met criteria.
Egypt was
too.
on denial.
All right. And is that making up a story, is that what we're talking about with the intruder or what she originally told Detective Flores?
Yes, she could not deal with the fact that she had done it.
All right. And in fact, when she, according to your information, it took several years, didn't it, before she could admit to herself what had happened?
Yes, it did.
All right. And is that psychologically speaking, is that the defense mechanism still holding up that long?
That's not unusual at all. Some people go through life with a defense mechanism impeding their lives. But it took Mr. Nurmi and I a couple of visits actually to help her get through that, to break down that barrier. And if you looked at it from the perspective of therapy, it would have been considered a therapeutic breakthrough.
Okay. All right. So let's go on to the next criteria.
B3. Acting or feeling as if the traumatic event were reoccurring includes a sense of reliving the experience, illusions, hallucinations, and dissociative flashback episodes, including those that occur on awakening or when intoxicated. She reported experiencing a number of intrusive thoughts and memories, either sometimes during the day or at night in her dreams.
What do you mean by intrusive thoughts?
Thoughts of Travis, thoughts of Mr. Alexander, thoughts of good times they had, thoughts of some of the bad times they had. And these thoughts would pop into her mind, and it was hard for her to
Good
shut
times,
them down.
it was the bad
Okay.
times.
So those-
It is a
that
whiskey
to me
drink.
met the
It
criteria
was
for
the vodka drink.
All right. So when you talk about intrusive thoughts, you're not talking about her having memories of what actually happened on June 4th.
No, because she doesn't have those memories.
And so When you say she doesn't have those memories, what do you mean?
That the acute stress condition that she was in precluded the hippocampus from forming those memories, and they're not available for recall.
So are they ever able to be recalled?
Probably not. If they don't come back within a reasonable period of time, it's not likely they will. And some amnesias remain permanent,
Okay.
and that's not unusual.
All right. And so when you talk about these intrusive thoughts, then it's more about her relationship with Travis?
Yes, the various aspects of the relationship with him.
Okay. And and the fact that they're labeled intrusive thoughts, does that mean that she's not able to shut them down?
That's correct.
Okay. And that met criteria B3?
That was, yes, B3.
Okay.
C3, inability to recall an important aspect of the trauma. Well, she doesn't recall it at all because she was in a state of acute stress. C6, restricted range of affect. Example, unable to have loving feelings. But her affect has been flattened.
You sit on a throne
blunted.
of lies.
She is not able to express highs and lows, and that, I believe, is a meeting of criteria C6.
Okay, let's talk about C6 for a second. So what do you talk about what do you mean when you say blunted affect?
A person's emotional range becomes very constricted. From the highs of excitement to the lows of depression, it seems to be very, very constricted, and the person comes across as being emotionless.
Is that how somebody expresses themselves?
That's the best they can do.
Well, that's what I mean. When you talk about their range of emotion, are you talking about how they express themselves?
Yes, how they express themselves.
Okay, so is that something that you notice when you're talking to patients?
Oh, absolutely. That's, yeah, we always make a comment about their affect and their mood in the mental status part of the report. It's the first thing we see.
Okay, so that's what you mean by, I'm sorry, blunted affect, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, she's choking on all
What was
the
the
BS.
other part that you mentioned was
D3.
C6?
And they're
With C6, there was something else.
C6, C6 and D. D3, difficulty concentrating. Well, actually, there's one more. There was D4 as well. I guess I left it out of my report.
Okay.
Which was hypervigilance. Being she used to be a very sound sleeper. That was reported early on in her diaries regarding some activities between Mr. Alexander and her. And she became very hypervigilant at the jail, easily awakened at night, and had difficulty falling asleep at times.
Now, how do you know the difference between the fact that she might just be, her sleeping situation is different and it's louder? How do you know that that's not what occurred versus hypervigilance?
Well, that could account for some of it, but it seems to have occurred over a long period of time. And so there's always a period of adjustment when we move into a new situation. And jails are noisy, there's no doubt about it. But she pointed it out to me. She said that she's very easily awakened by noise in the jail. And from prior to that, she was able to sleep very, very soundly.
Okay, and is this something that has then lasted over time?
Yes, it has.
Okay, so in other words, this adjustment period of changing sleeping situations, it outlasted this adjustment period?
Yeah, many people have difficulty going to sleep in a hotel room the first night or two that they're there. So that's fairly common.
Okay.
So I just realized this now. I should have also listed
Just now?
D4 as the criteria.
Okay, and that's the hypervigilance, right?
Right.
Okay, and what was the next
But
criteria?
she didn't.
That was it.
Oh, I thought you said D5.
Well, exaggerated startle response. I didn't see that much. But,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so how many criteria do you have to have before you can diagnose somebody with PTSD?
Well, and for criteria A,
Get some
you
sleep,
need
sir.
both of the following, which you did. For criteria B, one or more of the following, and there were 5. C,
Thanks for hitting the like button.
3 or more of the total of 7 that exist. And D, 2 or more of the 5 that exist.
All right, C, you said there's 3 or more?
I beg your pardon?
With C, there's 3 or more that you have to use?
3 or more, yes.
Okay, and what are I have C3 and C6.
Oh, yes, you're right. Gee whiz, I don't know what happened. Okay, hold on. Feeling of detachment or estrangement from others. That should have been
Gee
C5.
whiz.
Okay,
Sorry about that.
Gee golly,
okay, so what does that mean?
willikers.
Not being able to connect all that well, feeling detached from reality, not being able to deal with the reality of the situation
It's already
would account for some of
Been
the
marked in exhibit,
stories
sir.
that were
I'm
made up
pretty
in the
sure you can't
beginning.
alter it.
Okay. All right.
Judge, he's writing on an exhibit. I would ask that he not do that, please.
Actually, I don't think that
There it
that's the
is.
exhibit that he's writing on.
That's the report.
Yes, sir, if you're marking on a document that is.
Oh, no, this is my copy.
All right,
I
all
left you a copy there.
right, you may proceed.
All right, so based on these criteria, that's what tells you, and, okay, and let me go back to the test then. So how do the tests that you perform bolster this, what?
Excuse me?
Stop.
Can I say, yeah, I also,
I'm going to project, there's not a question in front of him, and so he can.
Abstained.
What did you want to say?
I wanted to say that she also meets criteria C7, which is a sense of foreshortened future. She was thinking about suicide for the longest period of time.
Okay. All right.
She got over that
And is
real
that something
fast,
that she
though, didn't
discussed
she?
with you when you first met with her?
Yeah, so we talked about that from the earliest times because it's always a suicidal risk, so you have to be careful about that.
Okay. All right. The scales on the PTSD test, what do they do to confirm what's in what you just told us?
Okay, now coming at this from a different perspective, the test is designed to ask the individual if they can identify certain symptoms or certain experiences that they have had. And a statement is in the question item, and they circle on an answer sheet the particular items that they identify with. And once that is done for the, I think, 5 different sections on the test, I have to add them up, determine if it meets the criteria, which are very specific. She met all 5 criteria, therefore meeting the DSM diagnostic criteria for PTSD. It's not quite as specific as this, but it's just a different way of looking at the same problem. And it also measures the severity of the symptoms as reported by the individual. And in that case, she indicated what they were.
Okay.
And what it was. And so that was another confirmation. Also on the Milan test, the 2 highest elevated scales were the post-traumatic stress disorder scales and the anxiety scale, anxiety being a major component of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that was yet a second confirmation of the diagnosis.
Okay, and when you talk about high elevated scales, what does that mean?
Well, that's a good point. I should have to be careful when I say that. The test generates an output from the computer. And can I hold it up to the jury and show them what it looks like? Or it's like a bar graph. It's a bar graph. And on one side is a score, and on the other side are the different categories. And there are scores for paranoia, schizophrenia, antisocial characteristics, and a whole range of them. Of those variables, anxiety is one scale, and PTSD is another. And the 2 highest elevations of those scales was the PTSD scale and the anxiety scale. And this was something that was scored electronically so that, it was like a second opinion to me.
Okay, so that further confirmed the PTSD.
Yes.
All right. Now you talked a little bit about, whether or not, can a person who causes
Jury's
the
there,
trauma, so
for
let's go back
sure.
to the criteria A1, right? That's the trauma, experiencing a trauma. So what if the person is the one who causes the trauma?
Well, recent research in the past 10 years has shown a report of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in individuals who perpetrate crime. I have a couple of articles that show this, if it's okay to show them.
Did you prepare a PowerPoint slide to help explain it?
I did.
And I think some of your examples talked about like a police officer who shoots somebody.
That's correct.
Okay,
And a
so
soldier.
Or a soldier who is killing the enemy.
That's correct.
All right, so in those types of situations, they would be the one who are, I guess, would you say
The
that they're
perpetrators of the act.
the perpetrators? Okay, so what does research tell you about the perpetrators of an act with regard to PTSD?
Okay. This is relatively new material, so I could only find a couple of articles. If I look deeper, I'm sure I could find more, but there's a law of diminishing returns. In this one particular study.
What?
Oh, Judge, I'm sorry. Can I publish this slide?
You may.
In this one particular study, they were looking at a population of mentally ill perpetrators. Now, this is not to say that Ms. Arias is mentally ill, but this is where the data comes from, and we have to do the best we can with the data. But I have another article that shows something similar.
Okay.
But in mentally ill perpetrators.
Can I just explain this for a second? And if you already are familiar with the law of diminishing returns, I apologize. The law is a principle stating that the profits or benefits gained from something will represent a proportionately smaller gain as more money or energy is invested into it. So what he just said is that he was only able to find a couple. He could find more if he spent more time on it. But if he did, it would mean less or be worth less. It would be a smaller gain than if he spent a short amount of time and found what he found. Something tells me that's not how you should operate when you're testifying in a capital punishment or a capital trial. Like, it just probably should do all the research, sir. Just throwing
These
that
are
out
people
there.
that were hospitalized after the commission of the crime, who committed an act of homicide. Of the 29 in the group, granted it's small, 19 were assessed by the PTSD scale, and they discovered that lifetime prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder following homicide was 58%. So 58% of this particular population, which is not an average population, I must admit, had symptoms, had PTSD diagnosed, whereas another 21% had partial PTSD. They didn't have all the criteria, but they had many of the criteria.
Okay. All right. Can you go to the next slide? And what does this article tell us?
Now, this is another story, another article about intrusive memories of perpetrators of violent crime. Now, these were not necessarily all involved with killing, because some of the victims were just seriously harmed. But 46% of the 105 young offenders, these were people under 30, reported distressing intrusive memories, which is a symptom of PTSD, while 6% were diagnosed with PTSD. So not as high as the mentally ill group, but still a significant number of people, suggesting that perpetrators of violent crime are subject to developing PTSD symptoms. So the fact that Ms. Arias was a perpetrator of a horrendous crime is not out of step with my diagnosis of her having PTSD.
Okay. So in other words, and when you say perpetrator, in other words, she's the person, she's admitted that she's the one who killed Travis.
She admitted.
And we're not talking about the reasons why, okay, at this point. But based on that fact alone, it's still very possible that she can suffer from PTSD just because she's the one who did the killing.
Yes, and again, I'm having worked with a population where violence was involved with police officers and so forth, I can attest to the fact that the percentage is probably a little bit higher than this particular study, but I wasn't doing the study, so I can't report my data.
Okay. And when you said, you mentioned your study with, or you're working with police officers, and in those situations, obviously they weren't considered necessarily crimes when a police officer shot somebody.
That was the traumatic experience.
Okay. And so you were working with those police officers with regard to their traumatic experiences.
Yes. For example, I remember one patient that I had, but not a police officer, who killed someone during a hunting accident. And he became so laden with post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that he required leaving work and going on disability. He was that negatively affected. Now, that's only one case that I'm reporting to you. But the fact of the matter is it happens. I've seen it. The data supports it.
All right. And with regard to you working with police officers and working with PTSD in general, how much experience do you have working with PTSD?
Well, when I was doing my forensic work back east, I had a lot of medical malpractice cases many of which involve medical injury due to surgical procedures. And many of those individuals develop PTSD as a result of their injuries. Because
he was an ambulance chaser.
They develop all kinds of disabilities, problems in living, obsessing about the anger at the doctor, and so on and so forth. And they didn't all meet that criteria, but quite a few did meet the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, and what other experience do you have working with post-traumatic stress? Is that just the
People
only-
that were involved in accidents, injuries, fire. Patient I had was involved in the MGM fire years ago, and he lost his lover and suffered terribly from post-traumatic stress disorder because he felt they were trapped on a floor and the other fellow died and he couldn't save him. These are the kinds of traumatic situations that can bring about post-traumatic stress disorder.
All right, and in terms of years, how long have you been working with post-traumatic stress?
Well, probably from the time that I began, maybe my first couple of years, I didn't have cases like that, but over 30 years.
Okay. All right. I think that was it for the slide.
That's it for that slide.
All right. I want to ask you about PTSD and acute stress. Do they have anything to do with each other?
They do. Usually acute stress, an acute stress disorder, may I define what it is?
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, let's go to your DSM and define acute stress.
I've never seen somebody
The
go back to a
diagnostic
book
criteria for an
as
acute
much
stress
as this
disorder.
guy does.
The person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or events that involved actual death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others. And two, the person's response involved intense fear, helplessness, or horror. Those are the, okay. And then criteria B.
Okay.
They ask for 3 or more out of the following 5. Here are the 5.
No.
A subjective sense of numbing,
This is
detachment,
not
or
good for a
absence of
jury.
emotional responsiveness. A reduction in awareness of his or her surroundings, being in a daze. Derealization, depersonalization, and dissociative amnesia.
Okay, let me stop you there. Derealization and depersonalization, what are those things?
Okay, depersonalization, when a person feels outside of their own body, they don't feel in contact with themselves, they feel like they're floating, spacey.
Okay.
Derealization is being disconnected from the environment per se and just functioning with themselves as the entire world, trying to maintain the reality as best as they can.
Okay.
Dissociative amnesia, we indicated, occurs because during periods of acute stress, the hippocampus does not form the memories that it does. We explained that before. And so dissociative amnesia is very common during this particular disorder.
Can I ask you something about that?
Sure.
Hippocampus, when it doesn't form the memories, are those memories ever available?
No.
Okay. All right. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. C, the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in at least one of the following ways: recurrent images, thoughts, dreams, illusions, flashback episodes, or a sense of reliving the experience, or distress on exposure to reminders of the traumatic event. I'm sorry, I'll reread that?
Yes, please.
The traumatic event
Mike. Oh man, I love him so much. Watch this. His face.
or distress on exposure to reminders of the
Poor
traumatic
guy.
event. I'm sorry, I'll reread that.
Like, yeah.
Yes, please.
The traumatic
Oh my
event is
God.
persistently re-experienced in at least one of the following ways: recurrent images,
Mike broke me. He broke me. He broke me because he started reading again the exact same speed, and Mike goes, "Judge, he didn't stop."
C, the traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in at least one of the following ways: recurrent images, thoughts, dreams, illusions,
Sure it is.
flashback episodes, or a sense of reliving the experience, or distress on exposure to reminders of the traumatic event. I'm sorry, I'll reread that.
Yes, please.
The traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in at least one of the following
Judge,
ways:
like,
recurrent
no, this is no
images,
better.
thoughts, dreams, illusions,
Go
flashbacks,
slower.
or a sense of reliving the experience, or distress on exposure to reminders of the traumatic event.
Okay, can you explain to us generally, what does that mean?
Well, basically, that means that a
Or you
person
could have just done that the whole
re-experiences the
time.
event somehow. Either they'll have a bad dream, several bad dreams, they'll have recurrent thoughts about the situation.
He can't even
They'll have
summarize it himself.
illusions, they may see shadows moving that remind them of it. They may have flashback episodes of the actual crime, or they may sense that they're reliving the experience, or they may have distress on exposure to reminders of the traumatic event. Now, that in my feeling was one of the reasons why the story was made up, to keep her
reread the
distance
definition.
from having to be reminded
Could
of
not
her
summarize
involvement in
it.
the traumatic event. D, marked avoidance of stimuli that arouse recollections of the trauma, blocking of thoughts, feelings, conversations, activities, places, and people. Another characteristic of the story.
When you talk
Still
about
typing
story,
what
doctor,
you're
you're talking
saying.
about like the intruder story.
The intruder story, I'm sorry, I'll
Basically,
be more specific.
That's okay. Basically, Miss Arias's denial.
Yes.
Okay.
That's correct. Marked symptoms of anxiety or increased arousal, difficulty sleeping, irritability, poor concentration, hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response,
This
and motor
guy.
restlessness.
Is a terrible witness. Terrible.
Okay. And you only need, okay. Then the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of life, or impairs the individual's ability to pursue some necessary task, such as obtaining necessary assistance, which was clearly obvious here, or mobilizing personal resources by telling family members about the traumatic experience.
Well, so what's clearly,
She was not able to
Obvious.
tell her family about what happened. She was not able to tell anybody about what happened. And this is a classic symptom of an acute stress disorder.
how do we know that she wasn't able to tell anybody versus she just doesn't want to get into any trouble?
Well, I guess that could be an alternative explanation, but when something horrible like that happens, can you imagine the feeling of isolation if you can't turn to a parent, if you can't turn to a friend,
Then
if
you
you can't
shouldn't
turn
have
to a
done it.
professional to seek some help? The turmoil must have been incredible. So I consider that to be a significant indication that she suffered from that disorder. The disturbance lasts for a minimum of 2 days and a maximum of 4 weeks, and occurs within 4 weeks of the traumatic event. That fits. The disturbance is not due to the direct physiological effects of a substance like drug abuse or medication, or a general medical condition, is not better accounted for by a brief psychotic disorder. We saw no indications of that, and is not merely an exacerbation of pre-existing axis 1 or axis 2 disorders.
Okay.
So she, in my opinion, experienced an acute distress disorder. Since you can't use that diagnosis for more than a month or two, you then have to switch to post-traumatic stress disorder if those other symptoms exist. And by the time that I evaluated her over a period of time, she manifested or verbalized to me all of the symptoms that I indicated
Of PTSD.
of PTSD.
Okay, so you said that with regard to diagnosing somebody with acute stress, you said that it can't be diagnosed unless you're talking or meeting with them at the time that it's going on. Is that
Within
right?
about a month or so of the incident, maybe 2 months.
Okay, and so because you didn't speak to Miss Arias until, I think, December of 2009,
Yes.
can you make a diagnosis with acute distress?
No, but you can more or less suggest that it probably happened based upon what I heard from
Okay,
her.
and acute stress, you said that because it only lasts for so long, because the diagnosis can only be given for so long, up to 4 weeks, does it typically go into something else?
It typically, if it continues, it's usually post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay, so in other words, when you say continues, if there's criteria still existing, it usually is manifest into PTSD?
Yes, the criteria change from acute stress disorder to post-traumatic stress disorder, but there are similarities and overlaps.
Okay.
So it fit the diagnosis.
All right, and with regard to, so we have post-traumatic stress disorder, and is that something that you can diagnose by speaking with her and everything that you've told us about?
And the test results, yes.
Okay. With regard to the acute stress, what does that do? Not just the memory of what happened on June 4th. Does that have any memory issues with regard to 2 to 4 weeks out?
a person could still have some difficulty formulating clear memories because the hippocampus may still be influenced by the flood of adrenaline and other chemicals that interfere with its ability to create memories. Now, during the flooding, the physiological flooding of the hippocampus and the other areas of the brain involved with memory, we would begin to see it dissipating after the trauma dissipates, goes away. But the impact may remain for some time. But gradually, the chemicals dissipate, they're flushed out, and the memory capabilities are restored. And so what may happen is that some memories can be retained and formed anew, but they may not be clear. They may be foggy. They may be snapshots in the brain, or they may even be confused in some way. But this is not at all uncommon.
To have the spotty memory?
Yeah, because memory it's not like a switch on the wall where it's off 1 minute and on the next. It's a gradual and not necessarily smooth improvement.
Okay.
Well, I'd say that that's probably enough for tonight. That and I'm having a real hard time with my eyeballs. It's just been a day. It's been a week. Good grief. I don't want to end it early, but I think we all need a break from him and come back fresh on Sunday. I'm also working on finalizing another sidebar. So hopefully we'll have that for you too. Brandi's still doing day court, of course. So we will be back soon. Thank you so much for sticking around with me. I hope to see you guys on Sunday. That is my goal, Sunday. And let me know if, reach out. Reach out if you need anything. I'm still around. I'm still here. Obviously, you can feel me feeling guilty for not having night court on Friday, but when the dad shows up, meh, Papa BC, as you guys have termed him, which I'll have to let him know about. He'll love that. You know what? Thanks for showing up for jury duty. Thanks for being you. Thanks for being one of the best chats on YouTube. I don't think that there's a better one. I'm just saying. So, take care of yourself and take care of your friends and family. Don't forget to smile. As Pantufle says, don't let anybody dull your sparkle. And like I say, shine on. Shine on, you crazy diamonds. Court's adjourned. I'm going to go amnesia myself to bed.